Hello, good morning, everyone. My name is Latoya Lazarus, and I will be your chair for this morning's event. We're looking forward to a very fruitful discussion, and we have some very capable presenters this week for the second round of the discussion on religion and spirituality and its role in sustainable Caribbean development. Some of you may have already, from the last discussion, we discussed the ambiguous and complex role of religion and spirituality in Caribbean people's lives. And we're going to continue this discussion. We hope we will be able to unpack some of the themes that were coming out in the last discussions, not just about religion in a understanding religion in a functionalist sense, but understanding religion and Caribbean manifestations of our various kind of religions in a kind of decolonial kind of lens. How can religion help us move forward in a sustainable way, not just when we think of economic development, but social, cultural development, the role of religion in some of our current issues relating to social justice, and all those I'm sure we will be able to touch on for the presenters. So I thank all the presenters for agreeing to be a part of this very pertinent SALISES forum discussion. And I thank you, the audience, for once again joining us, and for new audience who have never attended the forum, welcome. Thanks to the organizers as well. And so we'll turn over to Dr. Godfrey St. Bernard, who will make a brief remarks, and then we will go into the presentations.
Good morning to the virtual audience. And once again, I want to bring remarks on behalf of SALISES St. Augustine, an institute or a branch of an institute that is located across the 3 original campuses of the University of the West Indies. There are branches of SALISES on the Keyville campus in Barbados and on the Mona campus in Jamaica. And collectively, we engage in a number of events similar to the one that you are witnessing today. Of course, this series, the SALISES Virtual Forum, began in October 2021 when I assumed the directorship of the St. Augustine branch of the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute of Social and Economic Studies. And I am pleased to sit here today and bring remarks at the 18th installation of our SALISES Virtual Forum series. Today's forum is entitled Anchoring Sustainable Development Through Spirituality, Religion, and Morality in Caribbean SIDS, Part 2. And this one is considered to be Part 2 because there was a Part 1. And Part 1 was so interesting in terms of the wide array of issues presented by the presenters that a number of persons who are part of our virtual audience and who were part of our virtual audience insisted that perhaps we needed to have a Part 2 of this discussion. And hence today, at our 18th SALISES Virtual Forum, we are having Part 2 of that discussion. Just to apprise you of the mix of speakers that we had during Part 1, of course, we had our illustrious chairperson today, Dr. Latoya Lazarus, speaking and bringing a theoretical reflection on the issue of anchoring sustainable development through spirituality, religion, and morality in Caribbean SIDS. We also had Pastor Clive Dutton, who is a renowned religious leader, and he spoke on the issue of countering immorality and decay in Caribbean societies. He was followed by Dr. Nasser Mustafa, a retired sociologist from the Department of Sociology on the St. Augustine campus of the UWI, and he brought an Islamic perspective. Dr. Mustafa was followed by the Archbishop of Port of Spain, Archbishop Jason Gordon, who spoke from the perspective of Roman Catholicism. Archbishop Jason Gordon was followed by Mr. Ravindra Nath Maharaj, known as Raviji, who brought a Hindu perspective, and an Orissa perspective was brought by Ms. Aintu Pearl Springer, who represented the Orissa community. And last but by no means least, we heard from Mr. Ricardo Barat Hernandez, who brought the First Peoples perspective. So altogether in that forum, we had 7 speakers, and a wide array of insights were presented that created a fruitful discussion. Today, we have 6 speakers, and our 6 speakers include Mr. Bobby Andrews from Tobago, Reverend Dr. Glenroy Lalor from Jamaica, Reverend Dr. Kenneth Niles from Trinidad and Tobago. We have Dr. Meade, who hails from Northwestern University in the United States. We have Dr. Michael Barrett, who hails from the University of the West Indies Mona campus from the Department of Sociology. And we also have Chief Oloye Olakela Massetungi, who is from Trinidad and Tobago and brings an Orissa faith perspective. So we have lined up for you today a very impressive core of 6 speakers who will address the issue of anchoring sustainable development through spirituality, religion, morality, and how these themes apply in the context of advancing development in Caribbean SIDS. It was our thought here in SALISES that discussions around religion and spirituality, morality, do not feature as much as they ought to in all of the development agendas and all of the discourses leading up to framing development agendas. And we feel strongly that these discourses, the part 1 and now the part 2, will provide us with the kind of vibe and the kind of input that we deem necessary to fuel the kinds of discussions that are necessary and that would add to the mix of insights that already inform trusts that are geared toward not only the enhancement of the material good of our citizens and our peoples in the region, but also greater virtues that aim toward the sustenance of forces that promote equity, greater equality, and of course, development justice in the region. So having said that, I think I will end my remarks and invite the chairperson to begin the proceedings. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you very much, Dr. Godfrey. So, as I said, Dr. Godfrey already given you the names of our presenters, and I'll just introduce them briefly by order of which they appear on the program. So each presenter will speak for around 15 minutes, and then we'll open up the floor for some discussion and to unpack some of the themes that the presenter as brought up. So our first presenter is Dr. Michael Barnett. Dr. Michael Barnett is a senior lecturer in the Department of Sociology, Psychology, and Social Work at the University of the West Indies, Mona campus in Jamaica. His areas of specializations are critical race theory, African diaspora study, Rastafari studies, and sociological theory. In April of 2017, he was vested with the Ethiopian knighthood, commander of the Order of the Star of Honor of Ethiopia by the Ethiopian Crown Council for service to Ethiopia and the Crown Council. By virtue of this investiture, he is the first Jamaican on record to be inducted into the International Society for the Imperial Ethiopian Orders during the course of this 21st century. In terms of notable publications, so Dr. Barnett is well published, but we'll just highlight a few here. He has authored numerous journal articles on Marcus Garvey and Rastafari, as well as on matters concerning race and identity in general. He has notably edited and co-edited several books on Rastafari, such as the popular Rastafari anthology entitled Rastafari in the New Millennium, the Rastafari anthology, and then there are a number of others as well. He also has a 2020 vision perspective on the Rastafari movement. He has also single-authored the book, The Rastafari Movement, a North American and Caribbean Perspective. So that will be Dr. Barnett, and then Dr. Barnett will be followed by Mr. Bobby Andrews. Okay, so Mr. Andrews is the planning coordinator in the planning department of the Tobago House of Assembly and has had this role for the past 14 years. But he's also been a researcher at the Former Policy Research and the Development Institute and the head of education research at the Division of Education in the Tobago House of Assembly for 2 years. Beside collaboration with the CSOs regarding the MICS survey 2022 and the 3 Eyes of Herd Immunity in Tobago, Mr. Andrews coordinated Caribbean Statistics Day in 2019 and the Tobago Business Register in 2015. Also in 2019, Mr. Andrews presented at the Caribbean at the Crossroads Conference in Anguilla with the topic Combating Trends in Youth Defiance at the Source Missing Attachment with Responsible Adults, a look at the renaissance of spirituality. In 2002, however, Mr. Andrews coordinated with the newly formed Tobago Council for Sustainable Development, the first youth conference on sustainable development in Tobago. Mr. Andrews has also conducted research on issues affecting youth, including drug use, aggression, violence, poor educational attainment, teen hypersexuality, and peer orientation. Mr. Andrews is the holder of a Bachelor of Science degree in General Agriculture and a Master's of Science degree in Planning and Development, both from the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine campus. And then after Mr. Andrews will be followed by Reverend Dr. Glenroy Lalor. Dr. Glenroy Lalor is currently working as professor in the arts in ministerial studies, United Theological College, Jamaica. Glenroy Lalor research interests includes Caribbean ecclesiology and ecumenism, and has successfully completed all administrative responsibilities. He has authored many research articles related to Caribbean ecclesiology. I'm going to suffer with these words, ecclesiology and ecumenism. So forgive me for butchering some of these words in my rush to read everything. So we're following Dr. Lalor, will be followed by Dr. KB Dennis Meade, our lone female presenter this morning. So Dr. Dennis Meade is a highly accomplished academic with a diverse range of experiences in the fields of African American studies, African diaspora studies, and religion. As a postdoctoral fellow at Columbia University, Dr. Meade conducted research on the intersection of these fields, contributing significantly to the study of Black religion and its histories, communities, and cultures. Dr. Meade's involvement in professional organizations underscores her commitment to advancing the knowledge and understanding of African diasporic religions. As a member of the Society for the Study of Black Religion and an affiliate of the Crossroads Project, Dr. Meade has worked with other scholars to explore the complex and rich religious traditions of the African diaspora. Additionally, her service as a steering committee member of the African Diasporic Religions Unit at the American Academy of Religion further demonstrates her expertise and leadership in the field. Dr. Meade is a respected presenter, having shared her research at conferences held by the Caribbean Studies Association, American Academy of Religion, and the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute for Social and Economic Studies, SALISES, at the University of the West Indies, Mona, where she was also a visiting researcher. Her presentations showcase her ability to communicate complex ideas in a clear and engaging manner, making her a valuable asset to the academic community. Dr. Meade will be followed by Reverend Dr. Kenneth Niles. And Dr. Kenneth Niles is the Chief Executive Officer and President of the holding company Emmanuel Ministries Internationals for the past 30 years. He has specialized training at the Agai Institute in Singapore and in the United States, where he attained his doctoral degree in Christian psychology. He also attained Masters of Science degree in mediation studies at the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine campus. These skills have enhanced and supported his pastoral call for the past 45 years, serving several communities in Trinidad and Tobago. In addition, he has served as church conference speaker throughout the Caribbean, North America, and Europe, broaching several biblical topics and issues, focusing on restoring marital relations and the family. He also has a strong passion for maturing male leadership, to which he has released 2 publications, Man to Man Stepping Out and Man to Man Stepping In. He's also developed the Restorative Intervention Program for secondary schools, which focuses on the development of the student morally, socially, and spiritually. This husband, father, and educator, as well as author, continues to research and write with the focus of nation building and life transformation from a spiritual and psychological perspective. And Dr. Niles is followed by, and last but not least, by Olakela Massetungi. Sorry if I mispronounced your name. So Olakela Massetungi is a highly respected figure in Trinidad and Tobago, known for his leadership in promoting the knowledge of cultural heritage and traditional African spirituality. As the head priest and founder of Igbi Onisin Ele de Moyer, he has played a significant role in shaping the Trinidad Orisha identity, which is an essential aspect of the African diasporic religion. Additionally, he serves as the head of the Council of Traditional African Chiefs of Trinidad and Tobago, contributing to education and preserving the cultural traditions of the region. Through his work, he has become a vital figure in promoting cultural awareness and preserving the rich history of Trinidad and Tobago. So I've presented in a very rushed way our speakers, but we'll get to know them as they present their work with us. Dr. Barnett will be speaking from and sharing views on the Rastafari perspective. Mr. Andrews will be giving an overview of the socio-cultural perspective, while Dr. Lalor will be speaking, presenting a perspective on the Baptist Union of Jamaica, and Dr. Meade will be giving an overall theoretical reflection. Dr. Niles will be focusing on spirituality, religion, and morality towards development, justice, and Oloye, Olakela, will be presenting on spirituality, religion, and morality towards development justice. So there will be some synergies between the presenters' work, and hopefully we will have some fruitful discussions and interventions from, between the speakers themselves and between speakers and the audience. So without any further ado, I will hand over to Mr. Barnett to share his view. And I know I introduced the speaker, but I didn't introduce myself. I will be your chairperson, and I'm Latoya Lazarus, Research Fellow at the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute of Social and Economic Studies. So, Dr. Barnett, the floor is yours, and you have 15 minutes to share your thoughts with us.
Thank you, Dr. Lazarus, for your introduction, and welcome and salutations to everybody out there in Zoom space and in this virtual space that we are now using. My focus, as Dr. Lazarus just announced, is on Rastafari. And Rastafari is one of those, new religious movements that has come out of the Caribbean. It's something that is uniquely Caribbean in terms of its origin. Now, it originated in Jamaica in the early 1930s and was inspired, of course, by the crowning of His Imperial Majesty Haile Selassie I as the Emperor of Ethiopia in 1930, the 2nd of November, 1930. And you had various Jamaicans who were inspired by this crowning and saw him as essentially the second coming of Christ in his kingly character as we would say here in Jamdo. So His Imperial Majesty notably was given the titles Conquering Lion of the Tribe of Judah, right? Elect of God, Light of the World. And all of these titles essentially were considered as a sign that he was indeed the second Christ that many people have been waiting for and looking for. One is argument that the second coming would come through the lineage of King David. And as his lineage can be traced back certainly to King Solomon, and King Solomon, of course, is the son of King David, then his lineage does indeed go back to King David. And also having the titles Conquering Lion of the Tribe of Judah is very important. Having said all of that, though, very importantly, the Rastafari movement from its inception in the 1930s, and particularly under the leadership of a key first-generation Rastafari leader, Leonard Howell. There were four main Rastafari leaders, first-generation leaders in the 1930s, but Leonard Howell was probably the most popular one, and he was the most effective in terms of his propagation of the Rastafari belief system. So we had Leonard Howell, we had Robert Hines, who initially acted as a lieutenant for Leonard Howell, but then went his own separate way in 1935. We also had Archibald Dunkley, and of course we had Joseph Nathaniel Hibbert. So those four names people can bear in mind. But Leonard Howell has the distinction of founding the first ever Rastafari commune and community in Jamaica, a self-sustaining commune at a place called Pinnacle. Pinnacle is located in Sligoville, St. Catherine in Jamaica. And he established this in 1940. And this commune, or this Rastafari community, which was about 4,000 strong, so it was pretty much like a small township, in effect, was a self-sustaining community. It was a community that was pretty much independent of the outside society because they grew all the crops that they needed for food, potatoes, yams, ground provisions, had banana trees, plantain trees. They had livestock. They kept cattle and so forth. So they had livestock. And very importantly, they had a cash crop, ganja. Well, what we call ganja in Jamaica, what is generally considered as marijuana, cannabis. And that cash crop enabled them to derive an income such that you know, they were pretty much empowered economically. So not only did they have enough food to sustain them, because they grew effectively on the vast amount of land. Let me just say, Pinnacle at that time was about 500 acres. So we're talking about a considerable land space. Not only were they self-sustainable via the food, but they also had this additional cash crop of ganja, what many people consider as cannabis or marijuana. So a very self-sustaining community, but were looked on with great alarm by the wider colonial society at the time. And needless to say that while Pinnacle was up and running, and it was running from 1940 all the way till 1954, when it was very suddenly and drastically raided by the security forces in May of 1954 on the pretext of ganja, right, which was illegal in Jamaica at that time. But I want to dissuade anybody who is even considering the notion that they were squatting. They weren't squatting on the land. Leonard Hall actually paid down for the land to somebody called Alfred Chung. So he bought the land from Alfred Chung. And if they were squatting, they wouldn't have been able to stay there for the space of about 15 years. So for 15 years, though, this community provided, I think, a model of self-sustainable living, living close to nature, farming. Farming is an integral part of the Rastafari liberty, what we call liberty or lifestyle in general. Okay, and I would argue then we can see Rastafari in terms of their liberty, the lifestyle, as a model for sustainable living in the Caribbean. Because Rastafari, ever since its inception, very importantly, have seen the value of being close to nature, right? Growing plants, planting trees, you know, eat what you grow and grow what you eat. So Rastafari have long had this mantra and really, really do have issues with the current policy of Jamaica. We import most of our foods. And the argument is, why are we importing so much when we can grow pretty much anything that we eat? In fact, why not just cut out importation and survive on what we grow? And then you have a more self-reliant economy, an economy that is more sustainable, because then you don't have to be worrying about foreign exchange, generating foreign exchange so you can import pretty much all of these food items, which sell at a very high price, I should let you know. So the average prices of these imported foods are actually over and above the actual average salary level or income level of the average Jamaican. So we have an issue here with food prices. I can't speak for those of you in other parts of the Caribbean, but we're not at this point living a very sustainable existence because of this high importation. So one of the things I would throw out there is more emphasis on growing what we eat and eat what we grow, and cut back on the importation of food. Self-reliance is a very important mantra of Rastafari. As I said, many made their own clothes, certainly back in the day, fashioned their own garments, and so forth. So instead of buying the latest items from the US or the latest fashion items from Paris or something like that, why not fashion your own indigenous garments? Have your own garment industry, which is something that we have many skilled tailors and seamstresses who make and fashion African clothes. This shirt I'm wearing now is being made by a very dear sister-in of mine, Rastafari sister-in. So we can be sustainable with our clothes as well as our foods. And, you know, the whole thing about this reliance on first world commodities, this obsession with first world commodities, we need to question that, you know. Why don't we look within ourselves, look within our indigenous cultures, which by and large are African, of African origin, and rely on those to generate what we need for a comfortable, sustainable lifestyle. Okay, so I've just run through the self-reliance model that Rastafari purport and live actively as a working model, okay, in terms of this whole sustainable developmental model. I also want to say something about the theology of Rastafari, which is very important. Rastafari is concerned about the decolonization of our minds. After being subjected to centuries of colonialism and slavery, many of us here in the Caribbean are subject to mental slavery or colonized minds. And Rastafari, in the whole theological perspective, is a move away from the colonization of the mind. Rastafari argue that God is Black, undisputably, irrefutably, and do not worship a white God. You may have heard a song by Sizzla Kalonji, don't worship a white God and so forth. So the whole argument about the color, the race, show categorization then of God in the flesh, if you like, Jesus Christ, as some people would see when we talk about God in the flesh, as white, is seen as an oxymoron. It's really a slap in the face for us as African people. Why are we seeing God as other than ourselves? Marcus Garvey himself pronounced, and Marcus Garvey was a Christian, that we as African people have only just now come to see God through the spectacles of Ethiopia. So he wrote this in his first volume of Philosophies and Opinions of Marcus Garvey that was published in 1923. And this year, by the way, we're celebrating 100 years of the publication of Marcus Garvey's first volume of his Philosophies and Opinions. I would suggest everybody go and get a copy if you haven't. But Garvey himself argued that God should be seen through the spectacles of Ethiopia for Black people, because it does us great psychic harm when we see God, or the God in the flesh, or the Son of God, however you want to consider Christ, as somebody other than yourself, because then you're being othered, you're othering yourself, right? You become a second class person just by default, because you see God in another color, as white. So we have this colonial issue, and it's rampant in Africa. I've traveled to Africa many times, and certainly in West Africa, Ghana, I can say, the white Christ image is all over the country. You cannot help but notice this. And the praises and hallelujah are going to this white image of God. So we have to decolonize our minds, not just in the Caribbean, but even on the continent of Africa. The African indigenous religions are being forsaken with the acceptance of this white Christianity, this white version of Christianity. And it's very interesting because even in the Ethiopia, which I should say Christianity came about prior to the introduction by the Roman Catholic Church, almost 100 years before Christianity comes from the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. The Black Christ images that they have on their windows, many of these are being painted over as white, another sign of colonization. So this is something we have to actively work against, is the decolonization of our minds. This is for sustainable society. We have to approach things with a decolonized mind, right? With a colonized mind, we'll always be trying to be somebody that we're not, or try to imitate people and be something that we're not. So these are very briefly some pointers that I think that Rastafari give us here in the Caribbean for a self-sustainable lifestyle and self-sustainable existence here in these very perilous economic times. So with that, I'll leave it there. Give thanks. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Barnett. I think we can say that we have learned a lot from what you presented, and even though it was less than 15 minutes, you kept the time. So I'm looking forward to engaging with some of the things you have said in the discussion section. So we're going to move forward to hearing from Mr. Andrews. And Mr. Andrews, I'm handing over the floor to you. You have 15 minutes as well.
Are you hearing us?
Yes, I can hear you, but we're no longer seeing the screen you were trying to share.
Are you seeing it now?
No, we're just seeing you still. You have
Okay.
sharing, so.
Let me try that one more time. Shit. Yeah, are you seeing it now?
Yes, we are. You might want to put it on presentation.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay, then.
Thank you very much, and welcome to all the persons listening and presenters to come, and of course, in recognition of all the presenters that came earlier in part one. I'm tasked to look at the socio-cultural perspective, which is in a sense the work of many of the development psychologists and cognitive thinkers about the impact of society on cognition and development, and how the social environment develops not just the person, but the society. It's Vygotsky who coined the term that the mind cannot exist independent of culture. So basically what I'm trying to do is to dovetail from this and look at explaining human behavior. And I would try to focus on Bowlby, John Bowlby and company, which looked at attachment theory and its spiritual overlaps. I will look at the commonality between spirituality and sustainability, and I'll look at some wisdom dissemination. Previous speaker also spoke about Sizzler, that there are some cultural elements that try to bring wisdom to us in various forms. And we try to get a sense of what really is attachment and try to seek answers from other religions, not just from the persons who represent other religions here, but the persons who were represented in the previous. I think it creates an avenue for a wider discussion and perhaps for something like this to continue. So when we look at sustainability, even when we look at the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, there are three basic pillars, really. We are looking at economic sustainability, social sustainability, and environmental sustainability. And basically, it is the actions of man that, if they undermine any of those three, they would undermine sustainability by itself. And the question now becomes, what is the root of these actions, these unsustainable actions of man? And for this, I want to go to Jiddu Krishnamurti, Indian philosopher, who says action has meaning only in relationship. And without understanding relationship, action on any level would only breed conflict. He goes on to say that the understanding of relationship is infinitely more important than the search for any action plan. It means that if we take this to its natural extension, then the search for sustainability would have its answers in relationship. The action plan for sustainability will not be able to be understood unless we try to figure out what are some of those relationships that drive unsustainable behavior. And Bowlby said that attachment, now I use much of the descriptions of John Bowlby's definition from Gabor Mate and Gordon Neufeld in their book, Hold On to Your Kids. These are both clinical and counseling psychologists. And they say that attachment refers to the drive or relationship characterized by the pursuit and the preservation of proximity or nearness. Of course, again, in this definition, you see the word relationship coming up, but the issue is that the concept of attachment is not just the pursuit and the preservation of proximity. The ultimate goal of it is really connection. And Archbishop in the first installation says that from the Catholic perspective, that man was created as a relational being for relation with one another and for relation with God. But the product of that attachment, this drive for relationship, creates what is called a compass point in someone. All right? And it says that every child needs a compass point, the person who would sort of orient or drive the thinking, the behavior, the association. And as a result of those two things, we get to the concept, according to that literature, that all relationships are indeed hierarchical. And they go on to explain that there are 6 forms of attachment, 6 ways of attachment, 6 ways in which attachment, they consider attachment as a rope with strands. And it starts with the more primal forms of attachment, senses and sameness. Sameness deals with identity, senses, which initiates around the early forms of child development. Then goes to belonging and loyalty, and significance follows. And then love, feeling of intimacy and so on. And then the highest form of being known. Now, if you recall in the first installation, for who did not, I would want to make a plug for both of this series to be viewed as one. Because in it, N2 Springer says, I reject my invisibility. What she's talking about is being known. She's talking about the highest form of attachment. And I will go on to talk about something that she said later on, which becomes relevant to see the link between that work and the work of psychology. So ultimately, when we look at the behaviors or the actions of man, one way or the other, it's just the product of several things that came before. And so if you take this in reverse, then we're talking about before there's an action, there's orientation. And before that, there's the compass point. And then there's the function of the act. Attachment creates a compass point, and the compass point orients persons. And the orientation is the influence of the compass point, even if the compass point isn't there. In the socio-cultural theory, that's what Vygotsky and even Piaget talks about, the more knowledge of the others. So in this regard, it is important to see that there's a lot of parallels between these two, because in orientation, it talks about getting the cue of how to be, what to do, what is important and what is expected. The gang leader doesn't have to recruit. The gang leader, you have to go to the gang leader. You see, the activities, you can't be in the gang and alcohol or drugs is being passed and you say, no, I don't smoke, I don't drink, that's not my thing. By virtue of the need of association, attachment is already at play and orientation is already at play. And that is the invisible power, which I will talk about ultimately later on. So the question becomes, what really is this attachment? And they describe it as the invisible but most fundamental force for development. And it says a family cannot be a family without it. And the question is, well, if humans are creatures of attachment, then you can restructure that statement by saying that humans are creatures of an invisible force. And the question would be, for other religions, what is the name of that force in Ifa Orisha? I listened to N2 Springer. She talked about speaking to my inner self, my Ori. I've spoken to other persons of Hindu persuasion, they call it the Atma. I've spoken to Dr. Mustafa. He says, well, it has different names, but in Islam, for the most part, it's called the Ruh. And of course, Jason Gordon, the Archbishop, indicated that, hey, we have body, mind, and soul. So there's an overlap that I feel the challenge is having religion validate itself. It becomes difficult. So therefore, in a Christian perspective, they would say you move by faith and not by sight. But as part of social science, a key component of our knowledge and understanding is empiricism. I am saying is that there is a need for an overlap between the disciplines of psychology, in particular development psychology and religion, and we can see the critical things. But the important part is this. If humans are creatures of attachment, and for all intents and purposes, all religions speak to the issue of something else that is inside us, then perhaps there's need for us to consider that in the literature and jargon of attachment theory, that there's perhaps a seventh form of attachment. And that indeed, it may in fact very well be spiritual attachment. It may very well be the Ruh attachment, if it is in Islamic faith. It might be Atma or Ori attachment. So I'm not seeing it, even in the context of what Mr. Hernandez, when he spoke about, and even in Two Springer talked about Mother Earth and Earth having a spirit. It may not have roots in attachment theory, but it's not unlike conceptually when Newton says that in the universal law of gravitation, that everything that has a mass has gravity. And gravity, by definition in physics, is a non-contact or a non-directional force. And so the concepts that I am hearing coming across from various religions, I think if there's a way for them to come together to explore what the work of Vygotsky and Piaget and all of those persons, there may be something very positive that can come, that can bring a validity that the self-validation of the religion would be able to escape the natural bias. All right, so in terms of spirituality and sustainability, I am not a preacher. I have to do my disclaimers on all of those things, but I come from that tradition. So for each of the major tenets of sustainability, you can have spirituality tenets as well, but these are largely Christian. Therefore, a slide like this would be incomplete if another pillar doesn't say, this is the Islamic scriptural and devotional context. This is the Orisha. This is all the others. And so you can see where in the end, what we are really seeing is not different religions, but common threads of sustainability across religions that would help us navigate sustainability. And in the cultural context, I would move on from Cesar, our previous commenter. In our context, we hear what Ella Andel, says, bring down the power of love, I say. Bring down the power, she says, love to heal the nation is the greatest power. We have Johnny King singing, appreciation is another song that he says, money is very essential, but can't buy peace of mind at all. It's still like dog without a bone if you have the money alone, And then, of course, what it does is that there are people in the cultural sphere that give this conscious vibe, this concept of translating what they sense in this spiritual place to give us some wisdom to help us live in a better way. There are many things. And of course, there's scripture. Again, I can't complete it because I'm not well-versed in all different religions. But I think you could get the point that something like this can resonate with the lens of each religion. So in closing, I'm saying the wisdom of sustainability deals with transcending the economic, the social, and the environmental. And I'm suggesting that we have to talk about spiritual sustainability. It deals with peace, justice, and freedom, in which case it deals with human rights. It talks about the preservation of indigenous knowledge, because indigenous knowledge could also be seen as science in that regard. It has its observation, it has its cultural perspective, and the transfer of knowledge. But I would like to say that it also talks about the sort of spiritual gifts to mankind, because we have to get past the me, And Vygotsky in his work talks about private speech and its role in child development. Of course, in that, I'm made to understand that it kind of ends at a certain point in childhood development. But if you listen to N2 speaker, Springer, she says, I communicate with my inner self. She says, I communicate with my Ori. And so, in a sense, is that the private speech is not just thoughts that are running around in your head, as she is describing, and as Vygotsky is describing in childhood development. Vygotsky is saying that the private speech that children develop when they're thinking and talking to themselves, they are creating in their mind a second person that is their more knowledgeable other, that they can communicate with and get direction. So it is not, to me, abstract and far out for what these religious persons are talking about, because when you look at some of the theories in psychology in the socio-cultural perspective, they're very, very similar. And then, of course, I would want to introduce the concept of spiritual rent, just as how you have economic rent for the access to goods and services and the production and the use of them, and social rent, which is looking at volunteerism when the market system fails. There's the concept of spiritual rent, which is freely you receive, freely you give. It is the concept of, to the extent that even Jason Gordon, the Archbishop, said that he was quoting the Pope saying, every private property has a social mortgage. It is more than just from property. It is in terms of developing the human person that we have to understand that some people are not just broken physically and emotionally, that they may be spiritually, and that religion can play that role, the spooning house to help the human spirit. And I could go past this. The question, of course, would be which relationships we should get as priority would be God, of course, responsible elders, and of course the law. The important part here is that there's a part of scripture, and again, this is the context I'm coming from. Galatians 5:22, it says, what are these fruits of the spirit? Love, peace, joy, kindness, and so on. It says, self-control. Against such things, there is no law. And I think in there is the key to spirituality. So thank you very much. There's just a quick thing I would just say, that relationships, womanhood, family, spirituality, agriculture, and its healing power are important elements that we can go. And to close, the development psychology can help, and there may be a need for us to include the concept of spiritual attachment, and perhaps maybe the type of collaboration that might be necessary, just as we have a psychology research center, that maybe an interreligious and psychological research component can bring both faith leaders and psychologists together for a common path towards sustainability. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much as well, Mr. Andrews, for your presentation. And I'm sure we get to talk about some of the things in the Q&A that you've raised, some of the points. We're going to break a bit from what I earlier proposed as the format, because Dr. Barnett has to leave us for another engagement. And so I don't want to leave without us engaging Rastafari in the sense where we all know, as people who are actual, we study religion, or we practice religion, we live religion, that oftentimes when we talk, we're in these kind of forums, Rastafari gets marginalized and left out. So I would love to get the opportunity to ask if there's any questions anyone has for Dr. Barnett from the panelists and from the audience. You may type your question in the chat. If you have any questions for Dr. Barnett. Dr. Barnett, in the meantime, I'm going to use a kind of the chair's position to ask some things, because this is something I've been thinking about, of the way in which Rastafari has contributed and continue to contribute to a kind of Caribbean notion of decoloniality in our region, and a kind of reimagine. It's our kind of introduction of a critical race approach, right? A reimagining of ourselves it has given us. And we draw upon it for popular culture in that aspect of development, that economic kind of crude way where we pick and choose and decide this is what Rastafari looks, and it's packaged and sold and it's fun and all of that. But how do you see Rastafari? Because I am on board, and I see where you're saying how Rastafari contributes to this notion of sustainable development, which is obviously, COVID-19, the economic crisis has pointed out the need for self-sufficiency and for food security as well, for maintaining that. But how do you see how outsiders position, and when I say outsiders, I don't mean outsiders to the Caribbean, outsiders of Rastafari, how do we continue to position Rastafari in its role in development, in Caribbean development?
Well, I think that folks should take note of what Rastafari are proposing, some of the aspects, which is on self-reliance. I don't know, I think my perspective, honestly, Dr. Lazarus, is that we are too locked into this importation kind of, love of the first world commodities, commodification mindset. We need to kind of look within what we have within our own cultures, our own space. And if we're more self-reliant, our economies are going to be better off for it. Now, the fact of the matter is, here in Jamaica, we don't have the expendable income that is being lavished on this massive importation of goods. That's why, we have our economic challenges, because for one thing, once we generate the foreign exchange or the US dollars, as soon as it's generated, we spend that on all of these importations, whether it's clothes, whether it's food and so forth. I mean, even basic stuff like broccoli. In our supermarkets, literally all of the broccoli is imported, and we can grow that. And our farmers are growing it. And some of our local farmers are really under pressure because they're being swamped with all of these foreign items, foreign, food items that do injustice to them. I mean, they can't sell their own stuff because of the swamping of outside goods. So we're not following this mantra of self-reliance. We're kind of locked in a very combobulated mindset. I can't quite explain it, but I just think that it's all part of our colonial exposure, or the colonialism of years and years has done such a job on us that we're just locked into a vicious cycle where we do ourselves harm, and in terms of Rastafari, you mentioned a good point. I think some people have tended to over-commodify it and maybe only pick the parts of the cultural expression that they prefer to. For instance, Bob Marley's message is not just one love. You cannot reduce Bob Marley to one love. He was more political than that. I mean, he notably took one of the speeches from Haile Selassie that he made to the UN in 1963, in October 63, and we're going to be celebrating 60 years, where he said, until the color of a man's skin is of no more significance than the color of his eyes, you know, until. We haven't reached that point yet. The color of a man's skin is still more significant than the color of his eyes. So until we reach that point in time, will there be peace and will there be one love, right? But we can't fool ourselves into thinking that we're in a one love situation. We're aspiring for that, but we haven't reached there yet. So I want to point out that Rastafari has a very poignant political message that some people conveniently want to ignore because it may be inconvenient or it may be uncomfortable, right? The color of God is important. Some people obfuscate that, oh, it doesn't matter, I'm worshiping a white God. Well, if you're Black and you're worshiping a white God and God is supposedly mankind is in the image or humankind is in the image of God, then why doesn't your image correspond to the image of God? You know, these are simple questions. So you're doing yourself an injustice, and the psychologists can certainly really do considerable analysis here. It's going to create, you know, not just a disjuncture mentally, but dissonance is what we're suffering, and what we actually extenuate our sense of dissonance. We're still not comfortable with our own identities. Many of us aren't comfortable with our African ancestry, right? So there are a lot of issues that Rastafari have approached and Rastafari address. And I think that if people look on Rastafari in a holistic, holistic way, and not just pick out the little pieces that are convenient for commercial activity, a lot can be taken from that in the Caribbean in general. Okay.
Any other question? Yes, thanks, Dr. Barnett. Any other questions for Dr. Barnett? I have one question in the chat, Dr. Barnett. It's coming from Alicia Shepherd, and she says, given the multipolar religious sphere in the region, is it possible, and to what extent can we leverage them harmoniously for development in the region? That's a question that obviously all speakers can think about, but before you go, Dr. Barnett, would you like to address that one?
Well, what I would say is, I mean, to the extent that our religious practices and our religious ideological framework, to the extent that it can help one decolonize our minds, is to me is where the youth factor is. But if your religious framework actually reinforces the colonization of your mind, then to me, that's not a good thing. It's not a good thing. So we have to be brave enough, courageous enough to actually revisit our religious practices. Now, I love the fact that Orisha traditions are so rich and out there in Trinidad. I mean, that I think is great. And obviously we have Santeria in Cuba and so forth. But to what extent are these African indigenous religions embraced and really embraced by the wider community? I would argue that they're still in a state of subversion to wide-scale mainstream Christianity, which is Eurocentrically orientated. You may disagree, but I'm saying analyze it, think about it in a critical way. So what happens is when you follow many of these mainstream, listen, even with Islam, there's an Arabic orientation. So you see, within practicing these religions, what is the impact on one's culture? So many Muslims become Arabanized, right? Africans on the continent who practice Islam become African Arabs for all intents and purposes, at least in terms of identity. And in Sudan, it's a whole heap of confusion because there are many Black, obviously phenotypically Black Sudanese who don't even identify as Black. They identify as Arabs because they're so embedded into Islam. But with Islam, they also have taken on an Arab identity. So my thing is that practicing religions are great, but one has to be very thoughtful and one has to be discerning about to what extent are you then going into a culture which is not really yours, right? As African people, I think the closer we can get to our indigenous African cultures, which are devalued even on the continent itself, is the better. We have to recognize this as a reality, okay?
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Barnett. I like the way you've moved the discussion around development, where you've given us two ways of looking at development. One is the food security, self-reliance, that kind of traditional notion of development that is seen as the mainstream discussion. But you've also, and your other speaker as well, the discussion is also unpacking this other theme that is perhaps more uncomfortable. And Sylvia Winter had mentioned it on being human. What are these ways in which we're constructing selfhood and identities, and how religion in creating meanings helps us in that. So thank you very much for sharing your perspectives with us, for reminding us of the socio-political elements of Rastafari and its contribution to Caribbean, the possible contribution to Caribbean development, if in fact it is taken seriously and meaningfully. And so we thank you. Thanks for joining us. And we will move to the next panelist then. So
thank you, Dr. Lazarus. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So our next speaker will be Reverend Dr. Lalor. I feel like we're crossing each other's path, and I'm probably pronouncing your name wrong, but we've been in a number of seminars recently or discussions together. So welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lazarus. And I speak from the perspective of the Baptists of Jamaica, and I would want to take the liberty of including the Baptists in the Caribbean. I'd like to start with relating an incident. On Tuesday of this past week, which is or was observed in Jamaica as Labor Day, I had the privilege on behalf of the Jamaica Baptist Union, where I now serve as president, to be among those who were laying a wreath at the monument of the Right Honorable Samuel Sharp. The Right Honorable Samuel Sharp, for the benefit of those who may not be familiar with him, is a Jamaican national hero. His leading of the Sam Sharp Revolution, we prefer to call it, led to the demise of enslavement. The revolution was in 1831, and it was the last straw, many argue, that broke the back of enslavement, by communicating the message that if slavery is not granted by legal means, then the enslaved persons will take it by force. So we're laying a wreath at Sam Sharp's monument on that day. The day, May 23rd, was the day that he was executed for his role in that war of liberation. I am relating this story because as I stood in that section of the National Heroes Park, the place in Jamaica where monuments are built to all the national heroes, there were, in that little section of the Heroes Park, there were three monuments essentially there. One to Samuel Sharp, the other one to Paul Bogle, and the third one to George William Gordon. What do they all have in common? They were all Baptist leaders and who played an important role in that struggle. And I think that, for me, does two things for us, to do two things for us. Number one, it is acknowledging that the nation and the region has recognized the role of the church in the emancipation, freedom, and development of the people. That's one thing that it is doing. And the second thing it does for me is that it is giving us some insight into the understanding of Baptist theology, how early Baptists understood their relationship with God and what God expected of them in the world. So that's where I would like to start, by locating the Baptists of the Caribbean. There is no secret about it, and it is true that Christianity entered the Caribbean as a companion to colonialism, and to a large extent, it facilitated and reinforced the colonial practices. But we need to appreciate that the Baptists of the Caribbean represent a diversion and perhaps the first presentation of Black Christianity in the Caribbean. And this is what I mean by that. The Baptists entered the Caribbean, and it was brought here by formerly enslaved persons from North America, and who took on the responsibility of ministering to enslaved persons. These formerly enslaved persons were escaping the the American War of Independence, which they were perhaps on the wrong side, siding with the British. And many were threatened with re-enslavement. And so they were relocated, and some escaped to the Caribbean, and bringing with them their faith, their religion, their understanding of God, beginning first in the Bahamas and Trinidad and Jamaica. So the Baptist is the old mainline denomination, an old denomination, but that was started by Black people. And for many years, it was acknowledged as the Christianity of Black people. When you say Baptist up to the 19th century, Diane Austin Bruce makes that point. When you say Baptist in the 19th century, you're really talking about Black Christians. That's because it was unashamedly Black. Unashamedly Black to the extent that George Lyle, who initiated Baptist witness in Jamaica in 1783, named his church the Ethiopian Baptist Church. That's what it was called, the Ethiopian Baptist Church. So the Baptists, having established Christianity of the Black variety coming from the southern parts of the United States, initiated by formerly enslaved persons, ministering to other formerly enslaved persons and those who were in enslavement, had a difficult time navigating the Jamaican landscape because of the system of slavery. And as a result, after 20 odd years of independent existence, they invited the Baptists of the Great Britain to come and assist them in navigating that space. And after 42 years, they said to the Baptists of Britain, you know what, we can manage now, we are independent. So I'd like to make that point by saying that the early Baptists provide for us an understanding of the Baptist church that we are still trying to adhere to, and how the Baptist church can relate to sustainable development in the region. So when we examine the immediate post-emancipation period, what we are seeing is developing there is a Baptist understanding of mission. And it was the understanding of the early Baptists that full religious liberty could not exist without civil liberty. They were very clear on that you cannot have religious liberty without civil liberty. Samuel Sharp, as I mentioned earlier, made that point when he was going to the gallows. He said, God Almighty make we free, God has made us free, but Bakramasa keep we in a slavery. But the enslaved man is keeping us in slavery. It was their understanding. So despite the official stance of the BMS, Baptist Missionary Society, the Baptists got involved in the pre-emancipation struggle and worked hard to assist in killing what William Knibb, another Baptist minister, later called the monster of enslavement. And the theology of Baptist understanding of mission was well articulated by William Knibb. And I want to quote him. He said, to proclaim liberty to the captives and the opening of prisoners to them that are bound is a delightful employment. And here would I dwell that I may be thus employed. To proclaim liberty to the captives and the opening of prisoners to them that are bound is a delightful employment. And here would I dwell that I may be thus employed. So the Baptist understanding of the church's mission was in those days in direct contrast to many other denominations or understanding of church that still cooperated to some extent with the colonial church model and the missionary church enterprise. As a result, they were criticized and often vilified by both the planters and other churches. So by 1842, they were commonly accused, largely by some other denominations, as being ones who encourage a worldly and covetous spirit in the people. And the reasons for such sharp criticisms was that Baptist members and their leaders encouraged, and as they were guided by their pastors, they were more adamant in wage disputes and made much stronger demands on the planters than others. So they were therefore accused of encouraging a worldly spirit. In the self-understanding of the early Baptists, there was no distinction between secular and sacred, between body and soul, between a human being, between religious and civil relationship. And I want to offer a quotation from a Jesuit historian who was writing about the Baptist, Robert Stewart, who said that the Baptist sense of mission went beyond that of most nonconformist missionaries to an appreciation of this world that inevitably led to political engagement. They did not see themselves as divided between two worlds, the kingdom of God and that of man. The economic and the political lives of their congregation and members were as much concerned as their interior soul. And as a consequence, Stewart went on to say that you could distinguish and delineate from the practice of the early Baptists what he called Baptist theology, or Baptist politics is what he calls it. I prefer to call it Baptist theology. It had three components to it, which I think are all relevant to our understanding of sustainable development to this day. One is that they had a very clear understanding of the theology of mission, that God expected the Christian to be engaged in transforming the world, that the reign of God ought to be brought to bear as we engage in the world, that sin was not just personal, but it was social and institutional, and the system of slavery was sinful, and therefore Christians had a right to fight for its dismantlement. That was what these persons in the 19th century were thinking and believing and gave their lives for. And the other way that they went about this was that they had a strategic use of the elective franchise. Let me tell you what I mean by that. After enslavement in 1838, the Baptists began the Free Village movement. And it struck me that Dr. Barnett's comment about Pinnacle, the first free village established by the Baptists, was in the same area, Sligoville. It was in that same area where Pinnacle was located. And what they did was that the lands were parceled and sold to the formerly enslaved persons to enable them to get away from the plantation and to start their own economic project and economic program, to be kind of self-sustaining. That's what the Free Village was about. But there was something else about the Free Village. In those days, you could only vote if you had property of a particular size. And the property they sold to the enslaved persons were of the size that enabled them to register to vote. And that was strategic. It was their way of using the franchise as part of their Christian and spiritual responsibility for the development of the region. And they were also engaged in activity to augment the economic independence of the enslaved persons. So the mission theology of the Baptist then, and we hope and pray it continues to be so now, was informed by what later generations called holistic view of life, where the line between the so-called secular and the so-called sacred was removed. A world where religious duty required and did not exclude engagement in political and economic matters. A world where issues of labor, wages, and land were as important as personal morality. You cannot separate justice from peace, and morality does not mean that you accept people's exploitation of you. That was the view that they held, not popular in those days. They were vilified for it, so they lost their lives for it, but that was the view that later on both country and church, are holding up as important. So that is important. So let me sum it up by saying this. Baptist vision of mission in the early years of emancipation had about 4 or 5 different platforms, political platforms that they espoused. One was that they were very clear that there ought to be decreased taxation. There ought to be decreased taxation. 2, that this may not be so popular now, but they were encouraging the withholding of grants for immigration. And their reason was that persons were using immigration to further marginalize and enslave the Black population. 3, the decrease in the amount of money that the government was spending on law and order, and instead wanted that money redirected for social needs such as health and education. Remember, the education grant was minimal, and the churches stepped in to fill that void. And they also monitored class legislation. The Baptists actually in Jamaica had a team of ministers and others whose job it was to monitor all of the laws coming out of Parliament in those days to ensure that they were not in any way seeking to re-enslave people through legislative means. So their understanding of missions sought to fortify, and this is the point I want to make, fortify economic independence of the formerly enslaved persons. It included land tenancy, fair wages and rent, and the much heralded free village. That struggle continued post 1848 to 1865 when they got involved in just the physical fight for justice to the newly emancipated people, resulting in what has been called the Morant Bay Rebellion and the Morant Bay War for economic independence. So in discussing the Baptist role and responsibility in this project now of sustainable development, at the heart of it is an understanding that the God of the covenant created a world where God's intention was for the flourishing of all human beings and of the created order. That sin was not just personal, sin was social, and that the people of God had a responsibility to fight institutions and to transform institutions that prevented the flourishing of the human being, in particular, the vulnerable, the marginalized, and those who are left behind. They had no difficulty engaging in political and economic spheres of society because they did not make that distinction, as they saw that as an important part of all of that. That is what we consider to be the basis of our understanding of the role of the Baptist Church in sustainable development. And that is why we try our best to keep engaged in the social and economic and political spheres, because it is not just about creating a community and going off by ourselves, but about transforming this world so that the kingdom of God, thy kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. Amen.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lalor. Thanks for reminding us of the Baptist Church's role in social justice, in advancing social justice within the Caribbean, and its possible ongoing contribution. So it was kind of a nice critical reflection of for church to reconsider and think about its mandate and relationship to culture and to the society and its responsibility in that. So thank you very much. We're going to turn over now to Dr. Meade. And Dr. Meade, the floor is yours. You look ready.
Thank you. Just give me a moment to share my screen. Can you confirm that you're able to see my screen?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, great. So thank you to Dr. Godfrey St. Bernard for the invitation and all of the hardworking staff at SALISES in coordinating today's event. I've been very much enriched by the comments from the panel and look forward to discussing during the Q&A. In the time that I have, I want to offer some theoretical reflections on the theme and perhaps some notes towards the implications of these terms, religion, spirituality, and morality in the context of sustainable development. And as such, I've titled my talk An Ethic of Grace, Reflections on the Ethics of Religion and Development. So my remarks are largely informed by my training and research on Pentecostal charismatic communities and traditions. But I do believe that my musings today will have relevance with non-Western traditions, which may also mirror or incorporate what we have come to identify as Christianity. So first, I want to just kind of offer a kind of outline for, in the time that I have, some of the topics that I'll address. I'll begin with by outlining my theoretical framework, by thinking about how we conceptualize religion, how that conceptualization of religion can then lead us to understand how, with particular attention to Christianity, what that looks like on a localized level, and then launch into sort of what I have been calling sort of preliminarily an ethics of grace based on the work of Catherine Tanner. And the main argument of all that I'll offer today, whether I successfully am able to do so or not, and what I want to say to you all today is that this ethic of grace is a way to anchor a vision and strategies for sustainable development that is deeply communal and non-exploitative. And then I'll conclude with some notes towards a kind of vision for how a kind of ethic of grace can help us think about healthcare, youth development, and land stewardship in the Caribbean. So what do we mean by religion? And this is a question that vexes many people in my field. I am a scholar of religious studies. That means that my work is non-confessional by orientation and is very much interested in larger questions about the study of religion. But before I kind of get into that, I want to think about what we mean by religion. So religion in my field, right, we think about religion is not a priori, meaning that it's not a category of analysis that exists prior to our independent lived experiences and observations. There's no thing out there just called religion, right? Religion, rather, is a kind of concept that we create in order to name our experiences with divine forces and the kind of structures that we build up in order to articulate and make sense of those experiences. The study of religion, right, is then primarily concerned with how scholars and practitioners define and enact their beliefs, right, about the divine and their relationship to it. Again, relative to, let's say, the theology of religion that mainly draws its sort of intellectual authority from revelation and personal experience, and that is something that's deeply confessional. The academic study of religion draws on multiple disciplines to investigate what people say, what people do, and what they believe in relationship to the divine and each other. So for many scholars in the academic study of religion, we may draw on anthropology, such as the early work of Clifford Geertz. We might engage in it philosophically, thinking about sort of these abstract notions around phenomenology. Political science is also a very vibrant field in the study of religion, thinking about data and how it interacts with experience, more like qualitative or mixed methods approaches, and also historicizing religion, right? The categories, the experiences of communities, as Dr. Lalor, Reverend Lalor rather, so wonderfully explained to us about the Baptist tradition in Jamaica. So I'm actually going to, as we're thinking about religion, right, I want to offer two registers along which we can think about the idea of lived religion and institutional religion. So for me, the three terms that we have on offer today signal different orientations, right? But during my time today, I do want to focus on one, which is religion, and to explore the kind of registers that we can think about religion is at once institutional and at next turn also in a lived perspective. So on the first hand, religion as an institution speaks to the organizational life that is structured around doctrines and our voluntary participation in said organizations. So we think about churches, temples, shrines, which are places of physical places of where we gather, where devotees may enact their faith on the physical environment. And the doctrines that are central to sort of institutional religion, right, are often codified through oral and written histories, which offer a blueprint for what it means to be in right relation with the divine and right relation with fellow believers within a social context. Lived religion, on the other hand, addresses life outside, right, of these sacred texts and places of worship. And this concept of lived religion originated in the study of religious communities, mainly within North America, namely through the work of Robert Horsey. But in the tradition of Caribbean intellectuals trained in Western institutions like myself, I have found that the field of lived religion tends to be incredibly Western and white, and that the dearth of studies beyond North America focused on people of African descent raises questions about the imbrication of religion, race, and the legacy of coloniality in societies deeply shaped by the ongoing pressures of globalization and geopolitics. So part of my work, as I take it, my broader intellectual agenda is to kind of color, if you will, a traditionally white and Western field by focusing on the Caribbean. And I have found this framework of lived religion actually quite indispensable for my experience conducting ethnographic research at Tivoli Gardens, an inner city community in Kingston, Jamaica. So in thinking about my project and for our discussion today, my approach to understanding religion, right, is to study the kind of cultural work, institutions, and persons, texts, rituals, practice, and theology, things and ideas. So we're thinking about material religion. We're thinking about what people say, what people do, what people wear, where they find themselves in some relative to others, places they choose to convene, places they choose not to go, right? How they structure family life, their understanding of their roles within the household, and so on. And through these sort of different disciplinary modalities, namely that of participant observation, casual conversations, interviews, walking, deep hanging out, that this kind of work demands, I find that the category of lived religion offers us a really strong framework to think about what people are actually doing with religious idioms, how they use them, what they make of themselves, and the world with these idioms. So therefore, I study or think about religion as lived by focusing on practices, the significance of these practices, who performs them, when and where they perform these, and how in many ways this reveals more about the religious lives of individuals and communities than a narrow focus on doctrines and theological principles. So using this approach to religion, that is a lived religion approach, we're better able to apprehend the practical and imaginative function of religion, how individuals and communities of faith respond to the world in which they find themselves, and in turn, how they use religious frameworks to shape life worlds that reflect, the values they esteem, how religion operates pragmatically, and the ethical orientation towards religion and development is what I am mainly interested in here. So as we have talked about, Dr. Reverend Lalor has wonderfully expressed how this term religion, or rather Christianity as a form of religion, the kind of burden of that endeavor, right, as it's laden with the kind of efforts on the part of white settler colonists, right? That European Christianity, in large part, has been the handmaiden of conquest and genocide of indigenous populations in the New World, and was a justification for African enslavement. Christianization in the New World during the Age of Empire, and also in our contemporary moment, right? And we see through the spread of namely Pentecostalism as a form of US evangelicalism, has as its driving force a mission to civilize, by which we mean displacing, and I dare say dishonoring, the worldviews and values that make these cultures unique. The Christian binaries of good and evil, right versus wrong, actually narrows the spectrum of what is considered morally permissible. And I'm willing to talk in the Q&A a bit more about this view of morality and approaches to national development, because I have very strong feelings about that. But just to kind of summarize, right, but given this colonial, white settler colonialist history of religion, namely Christianity, its relationship to capitalist endeavors, and our topic of development, I want to share sort of Dina Freeman's summation of this theory of capitalism and religion, which she is building on the work of Max Weber in his seminal text, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. Wherein Freeman says that Protestant belief led to an ethic of hard work and limited consumption that had the unintended consequence of leading successful enterprise and capital accumulation, and thus the further growth and spread of capitalist economic practice. This relationship between Protestantism and capitalism then stimulates a kind of transformation of behavior that can lead to success, or at least an upward mobility in the contemporary neoliberal economy. And Freeman's work is mainly focused on Africa, but I believe NGOs in Africa and faith-based organizations, namely, but I believe her summation and her perspectives have the potential to help us think about what is happening in the Caribbean. So even, right, with this weight, right, of white settler colonialism, right, that there is a way that even we have taken the master's tools, right, and made them our own. And we see these an example of revivalism in Jamaica, Rastafari throughout the Caribbean, the Shouter or Spiritual Baptists in Trinidad and St. Vincent, and forms of Afro-Protestantism. And we think about African-American Christianity, also known as the Black Church in the US. We think about Jamaican Pentecostalism, drawing on the work of Diane Austin Bruce, and also Native Baptists as a precursor to the Jamaica Baptist Union. So we have taken, right, the weight of this colonial and civilizing mission, right, and made it relevant to our cultural norms, ideas about community and human flourishing. So I want to think about, right, this idea of human flourishing and development under a capitalist order that was authorized by Christian perspectives and spread throughout the world through Christian missionization. And I want to think about that as the kind of backdrop of what I've been thinking through as a kind of ethics of grace within development work, right? And this ethics of grace, as I'm thinking about it, builds on Catherine Tanner's work, her text, An Economy of Grace. And Catherine Tanner is a Christian theologian who, through this work, has evaluated economic relationships through the lens of Christian theology. And her study offers a sort of economic model, or better, a sort of ethical orientation towards economic theory that could possibly serve as an alternative to global capitalism. In An Economy of Grace, Tanner argues that that this economy, right, is very much distinguishable or different from this kind of capitalist economy, because at its center is an ethic of unconditional giving and non-competitive possession and use. So when I think about this, again, it's sort of ethic, right, of this economy of grace, thinking about grace as an alternative approach to organizing labor relations and economic relations, right? That is distinguishable from a capitalist economy, because unlike capitalism, which centers individual enterprise, that thinks about private ownership and possession, and is based on a system of exploitation, that an economy of grace, right, removes this impetus towards exploitation, possession, by replacing it with the concept of grace, right, which is one that is based on unconditional giving, right, and receiving. So I want to riff a bit on, so as I'm thinking about this ethic of grace, right, that Tanner's concept of grace and the economy provides some preliminary thoughts for what a possible economy of grace as a framework means for development, particularly within non-Western societies. And I want to argue that this ethic of grace could orient our strategies that are sustainable, non-exploitative, and inherently communal. And what this means is centering care, unmerited favor in accessing goods, resources, and knowledge, and reorients our understanding of wealth as away from wealth being simply monetary. So I want to offer a few examples as a kind of way to kind of begin to think through, right, what this might look like. And I'll place a disclaimer that these examples are just that, they're examples. They're complicated examples. They're examples that are fraught with negotiations around power and gender and sexuality that we have to keep in mind, right? But can offer us sort of inklings, right, of what a sort of ethic of grace might offer us in thinking about development. So I want to offer first a case study of the Christ Apostolic Church Maternity Center in Nigeria. It was founded by a local Pentecostal movement, which started in the 1930s, and the maternity centers, the first one was established in 1959. And it was established, founded, right, to establish the autonomy of Nigerian ministers from the colonial state. Faith healing was and remains a very central feature of CAC ministries, and is namely geared towards women who are members of the church. And just an idea, right, of thinking about what I said earlier about, one, the indigenization of Christian norms and values, right, relative to what is culturally already available, and thinking about how that connects us to ideas about development and redefining wealth through a kind of ethic of grace, right, that the maternity center in Nigeria, right, is very much embodies the kind of Yoruba principle of Alafia, which directly translates to peace, but is more broadly understood as encompassing health, success, and prosperity. And that prosperity entails material wealth, yes, but more so a wealth in people. And namely, these centers are focused on women and offering care and support as they endeavor to have children. So the one sort of the central feature of these Christ Apostolic Church Maternity Center, right, is that healing services are very important, right? And that these synergies among Yoruba traditional practices and Christianity are seen in these healing services, where the use of water, right, is important, the laying of hands, and the importance of prayer as part of the healing process. But this comes with one caveat. Women could not visit indigenous shrines or consult with herbalists or medical doctors to get pregnant or to carry pregnancies to term. Prayer and prayer alone within the CAC maternity center model was and is the only medicine. I will say that in early days of this, the center actually faced a lot of harassment from the state on the basis of the legality of offering maternal care outside of a Western medical model. However, there with some alignment with the state's concerns, Nigerian state's concerns about public health, and the kind of value of this organization and this work, right? Who not only provide care for women, but also sponsored women in the community to receive midwifery training, right? And to become learned in sort of birthing practices. So the maternity center's religio-medical focus, right, is an example of the kind of institutional and lived religion, but it demonstrates the pragmatic effect of religious beliefs that is directed towards a public good. It is evidence of the kind of lived religion where the practice, right, of grace, right, of resources, of favor, right, without the sort of emphasis on receiving and building material wealth, right, we can see it embodied in this example. Also, it's a sort of stands as a kind of example of the kind of selective integration that I spoke about earlier of indigenous cultural values and practices that can also influence public health outcomes. So I'll do one more because I just received a message that I'm out of time.
Yeah, can we save the one more for the Q&A? So
sure. Okay.
I hate to be the one who breaks it because of course I'm enjoying it all.
That's okay. We can save it. I'll come back to it. Thank you for your time.
I do appreciate your walking us through religion as institutional practice and tied to an institution and the notion of lived religion that I've often myself kind of found attractive, but so I'm interested to see how you develop it in your work going forward. And so we can discuss that more.
Absolutely. Thank you.
I'm very appreciative of that. So we're going to turn now to Reverend Dr. Niles. Your turn. Dr. Niles?
Yeah, here I am. Yes, very exciting times here. I almost said to myself, what do I say after hearing Dr. Lalor and now Ms. Meade? Because I kind of maybe it's going to establish some kind of balance here. But let me just, I forgot it's me and my computer at this age. Where am I? Here. And I here. Here. Something's going on here. All right. So this is I was given this other little topic here outside of towards development justice. And so that I wanted to bring out from a biblical perspective, because I see I'm representing that little faction that there is being mentioned, the Pentecostal Christian perspective. And I think it's important for me to maybe look at the scripture and to bring some balance here. I want to look at this scripture here, getting a screen that I shouldn't get here. This what's good? Yeah, from John chapter 8, where the woman was caught in adultery by the Jews and the Pharisees and Sadducees. That's very strategic.
Niles,
yes.
Sorry to break your strain of thought, but can you put your presentation into full screen at the bottom?
It is full screen. I've seen full screen.
No, we're seeing it as, we're seeing your next slide. So we're seeing it very tiny. So at the bottom, you can just share it.
I am not sure.
There's a little project. So at the very bottom of the screen, you have 4 boxes, a little thing that looks like books. It says notes. Then you see.
No, I have a full screen.
You're seeing full screen.
Yeah, let me go back.
Can you? Yeah, sorry. It's unshare and then start again and see. Something must have gone wrong then. Sorry to disrupt you.
Yeah, that's right. Something is going wrong because I am buffering. Are you hearing me clearly?
Yes, I can hear you. Sound is perfect. We can try it one time, and if it doesn't work, then we'll make do.
I'm buffering. It's buffering. I don't know why it's buffering.
We can still hear you. Your visual is a bit off, but we can hear you. So you can put it in. And then you select slideshow from the top menu.
Shit. Everything is perfect. I can't. It's amazing.
Okay, you might be having a bandwidth issue. Share it as best as you can, Dr. Niles. I think it's more important that we hear what you're saying. Are you still with us? Okay, I think Dr. Niles is frozen. He might be having some technical issues. So, I'm we're going to move to Chief Massetungi, please. Chief Massetungi, are you ready for us? I know we're putting you on the spot. You thought you had a bit more time, but we will give you the floor.
Okay.
Thank you.
Salutations to the spirits of our lands, particularly Ile and Lanani, at the Aloe Nanani is the name for Trinidad, Aloe the name for Tobago. So where we are looking for justice in this conversation here today, we have to pull the arrow backwards before we shoot it forward. And we have some unfinished issues throughout the world, but particularly in the Caribbean with regards to land ownership and the stealing of lands by people from abroad as we came to this part of the world to populate it with another population who were kidnapped. So I'll begin by saying reverence to the Great Spirit, Tamushi, Kai, Wakantanka, and the many and various names uttered by First Nations inhabitants. I thank the conveners and organizers of this discourse that have seen it fit to invite the voice of Al-Kibulani spiritual and traditional sacred science to empower the discussion with our perspective. And in an offer, I just have to make some explanation. We are accustomed to calling the great continent the mother of all nations, the mother of all people, the mother of all places, the mother of all sciences, the mother of all reading, the mother of all writing. We are accustomed to calling that place Africa. But Professor Joseph Ben Buchanan, one of the writers of modern times in the Pan-African world that mobilized the minds of many across the world, told us that if we really wanted to give our respect to Mother, instead of calling she Nanny, let's just call her Ia. Let's just call her by the name we were accustomed to calling ourselves. So from time to time, you would hear me using the word Al-Kibulan. It's not the only name for Al-Kibulan, but it is one with which I am satisfied. In his preface remark in the document titled Vision 2030, the National Development Strategy of Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, the Right Honorable Prime Minister, Dr. Keith Christopher Rowley, noted that the circumstance, and here in quotation, that the circumstances we now face require sacrifice and managed adjustment, so that the ideals that, and close the quotation here, so that the ideals that the region and globe pursue may be attained. If we have not already begun, how and when shall we take this step to development justice? Today, many countries and their governments and elected leaders espouse a narrative that suggests that slavery is a past tense issue. And so discussions like these often begin without a restatement of those incorrect assumptions that slavery is something of the past. Previous historical episodes on planet Earth saw an escalation of intolerance doctrines promoted mostly in the disguise of religion and development politics. Empires and ultra-rich entities and individuals emerged who created pseudo-institutions that defined for the confined and emasculated world what reality is. So as I begin this conversation, I want to suggest that our entire political and economic systems are both tools and instruments of slavery. I suggest that to remedy the many wrongs and imbalances challenging ethical, social living, that there needs to be a gathering of nations, and I'm particularly going to use some of these words, nations and tribes coming together on the basis of equality as individuals and autonomous representatives of planetary citizens. You know, part of my own concept is that we have become nation states over the years, but for many years, planetary people, when particularly those who saw themselves as explorers and discoverers, and they came to places where we are, they would ask, who are you? Just suppose that we had given ourselves the name Yoruba, which is not quite true, but let's say we were Yoruba. They say, who are you? They say, we are Yoruba. And what is the name of this place? They say, Yoruba land. So we were always in old world places, the people and the land, Matabele land, Zulu land, Hausa land, Yoruba land, Apache land, east, west, north, and south. We never separated ourselves from our great mother, the earth, the land. So in this discourse where we are asked, how can we move towards seeing some kind of justice done for spiritual religion and morality toward the development of justice, I am going to just try to look at some things that could be practical. Yesterday, the original formation of the Organization of African Unity was celebrated by many across the globe. At Addis Ababa in 1963, the Monrovia position led by Osagyefo Kwame Nkrumah, with the hospitality of His Imperial Majesty Haile Selassie, brought into being the OAU. The year before that, people a little older than me, they would have celebrated something we used to call here in the Caribbean Empire Day. Could you imagine? We had to sing God save the Queen and God bless the Queen. As we engage this current moment, my aim here is to present what I see as practical steps to lead to the re-empowerment of our Kibulani speakers globally and worldwide. Our dehumanization and decolonizing processes took a number of forms. Among these processes, the following areas need to be looked at. Loss of homeland. We have to, we're looking at the current moment, but we really came to, not that we come to this part of the world the first time, we were great travelers and explorers. We moved, there's a fellow called Heidel, and there was some kind of run-tiki exercise to see if you could move from a current from the one coast of Africa and come down in the Caribbean, and people kind of make it, and they look into the pyramids and they saw that, oh yes, these people knew about sailing and architecture and boat building and all of these things. So now, so here we are, a great people with science, with not only science in the physical sense, but high science and metaphysical science. They come and meet us like that. We engage in human trafficking, a nice word, nowadays, in the world we deal with today, the way they make things and make it difficult sometimes to repair it and redress it. Because we used to have some words long time when you hear those words, right? When you hear that word, you know you don't want to be that. But now they make it nice, they give it nice things. And I don't want to go into some areas that the world feels is the right way, that everybody has a right, and therefore, even I believe that, and I believe that I have a right to be wrong. So in doing these things, it means that something that should be bad long time, the way the word, but that bad thing comes so long and intellectual, it's hard to address it with full force to be able to deal with it. So we lost not only our land, but we lost our language, we lost our traditional right, but most important, we lost our name. And among the things here, among these things, so all this in the background of the displacement of indigenous people who we speak and are still, as we speak now, they are still dispossessed of their land. So, we are trying to make an argument for ourselves, but we are trespassers. Most of us here are Kibulani's origin. We came here freely at one point in time, then we got caught up and then displaced another group of people and they put us here. And if we want to right the wrong, we have to go back to the crime scene. We have to go back to the moment of the crime scene and deal with some of those things. So how can we remedy these losses? And I'm going to go down because I suspect I have about 5 minutes. I know I came in a little before my time, right? But we're trying to keep it. How can we remedy these losses? Reclaim our heritage names as the first thing, because your name is your destiny. Where are you? Where are you going to? Well, I am going to Olakela, where wealth and honor will breathe clarity and wisdom and sagacity. That's my name. That's where I am going. So we have to reclaim our name. And I am suggesting that names are indeed sources of power. This being the closing 18 months of the International Decade of People of African Descent promoted by the United Nations, and though feel that Caribbean people and people here didn't fight to make that happen, right? This being the closing period of time, I am suggesting that, my community is suggesting that the state and global institutions, especially those that have been directly responsible for the fragmentation of ourselves and loss of our names and communities, provide legal monetary and other openings for people of Al-Kibunani's origin to legally reclaim our names. Land return and compensation. But here we were in our land, we must, if we used to use Mr., we would have been Mr. somebody, we have our own house. So you might have called the house a hut, but it was ours. We felt full authority over those pieces of land. They take us, we rather put us in some barrack or some pen or some kind of thing to deal with. Well, we want reclaim of our homes and our land. And how can we do that? We are suggesting that the group body be set up by the state as well, right? As persons brutally kidnapped from our homeland, and we suffered a majority of losses, including land, status, social and economic systems, names, spiritual structure, social organization. We should establish a world court that is empowered to adjudicate and pass judgment to return lands on the continent of Al-Kibulan to the descendants and the communities of the descendants of Al-Kibulani's people in this part of the world. Now, I don't know how easy that is to do, but I'm saying that we set up courts, somebody kidnapped somebody from some European or other country and so on, and we quick to form things to be able to adjudicate and to find issues on that. But when it comes to ourselves as a people who have been dispossessed, who have been raped, who have been destroyed mentally and socially, where we under pandemic conditions at the current moment, we can't do that. I think by my own timing, I might have arrived at the end of my time, so I will leave the other precious things for when we engage. Thank you very much for having me. I feel awed and humbled to be in the presence of all these people with letters, because you notice I'm the non-lettered person here. But I thank you for having me. Adupe Lopo Lopo.
You're the only chief among us. So thank you.
Super.
Okay. And you've touched on a topic that is very sensitive, because it's forcing all of us here to do critical reflection, sensitive but necessary, right? A critical self-reflection and an appeal for us to go back in order to move forward and consider the layers of disenfranchisement and continue ongoing coloniality in our region that affects us based on our differential identities in different ways. And I'm seeing a broadening call of what we position so far at CARICOM as a reparation plan, and that it may in fact be limited in who gets included. So that's a very, I appreciate that those insights, those critical insights, and we'll move forward and hopefully we'll get to talk about it, because we're seeing this synergy in all the presentations this so far, and at the heart of them, and I'm sure Godfrey didn't tell anybody to speak about it, but at the heart of all these presentations is we're addressing the issue of coloniality and of being human, and reclaiming of being human, and how religion and spirituality and our various other identities play a role in either taking that away from us, but possibly bringing us back on path to reimagining that. So I'll end there and move on to Dr. Niles. You're back with us.
Yes, I am.
All right. So you have the floor, and then we open for Q&A. Thanks.
Okay. Where did she say to go? Slideshow. From the beginning. Right. Are you seeing these slides now?
Yes, we are seeing the slides, and
okay.
we're good to go.
All right. So I'm looking at this towards development of justice, spirituality, the whole issue of justice here within this whole issue of development. And I am very happy to be here, hearing, as I said just now, from Lalor and Dennis Meade, that consciousness of the presence of that slave movement coming down from Africa. Of course, we also have indented slaves from other continents. but bringing with them their religions and their cultures. That was their means of support, their own social identities. And so when they came in, they had that richness in terms of that freedom for worship and free the people. But up come Massa, and Massa kind of took that from them and had that agony of what do we do. So they were, Massa imputed their own religious ideologies, which of course came out through the Anglican Church, the Catholicism, and they were forced into another kind of religion and to make their own subservient. And so we have that kind of post-pre-colonial, and of course, with the post-colonial now, we are re-identifying ourselves as to who we are. I wanted to look at the scripture here, looking at John chapter 8, and looking at this whole scenario with the woman who's caught in adultery by the Sanhedrin, a very strong religious body of that time, establishing all the Jewish protocols and all the Jewish religions. But yet, in the midst of that, there's this guy, Jesus, God incarnate, living among them and living quite differently. To use Dennis Meade's word, living with a particular grace that seems to be antagonizing or coming in opposition to what was being taught by these religious people. And there's that, they call this woman, and Master, it was for they highlighted, Master, this woman was caught in adultery, the very act, and should be stoned. So immediately, there's that concept of a moral value, and immediately the issue is stone. Let's stone it. And of course, that stone is not just a bruise, that stone is to death. What kind of justice are we having here, and what are we seeing here? But Jesus was, of course, being tempted, because of course he's so indifferent to them. They want to get rid of him. And so he bends down, writes on the ground as though he wasn't hearing them. And afterwards, he said to them, let he that is without sin cast the first stone. We realize that they, from the eldest to the youngest, eventually left her, and there was she alone with Jesus there alone. If there are other verses you can read, but it was a whole issue of who is without sin. And the challenge here is to realize that as a people, we all have our indifferences, we all have our idiosyncrasies, and we all have positions that we have to recognize. But when we are about to serve justice to any particular party, whether individual or group, we have to remember, hey, let's look in the mirror. I remember my mother telling me years ago, if you're pointing one finger, remember there's three others pointing back at you, because we have to take into account what's happening here. So that when we talk about spirituality, and these people, these Sanhedrin people were very spiritual. They knew the law. They were praying every day. But here they were not seemingly identifying with the very heart of humanity as Jesus. And I like how Meade talked about that, the issue of grace. So what is the Spirit? Because as Lalor established, that we as believers, we establish the Holy Spirit. We establish the Spirit state. But of course, there are others in today's world, there are other spirits, because coming out of their own Africanism and traditional religions, we know that we are in that spray where other spirits, people identify with the spirit world. And so that we have that context too. But also, man seems to be able to be taking that context and says that I have to be Lord over you, and therefore I have a voice. I can make choices for you. And we need to come to that place. If we are in a religion, how do we identify that? Is this a way of life? And of course, Meade again identified the institutionalized as against the living. So from that institutionalized concept, how do we translate, how do we transition out of a formulated structured part of God to the very real? And these days I have been actually preaching about that, trying to get people to live what they believe, rather than just believe it and use it as a weapon tool to establish. Jesus Christ talked about the law, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, but I'm here for you to turn the other cheek. I'm here to engage a conversation or to engage a relationship where we can identify justice, not in me trying to make you wrong or right, but to see how best we can go forward. The whole issue here is about giving us an opportunity for direction. How do I with that? Now, in this context here of John 8, we're dealing with morality. We're dealing with the accusation of this woman caught in adultery. But remember, they were also there. They weren't seeing the fact that they were in the same environment perpetuated. They didn't say stop. They saw her, caught her, brought her. And sometimes we are part of a system that we need to step back and say, hey, where's my voice here? What am I doing here? How do I view the activity across and my own activity? What is my expected behavior? How do we behave? We've heard from the speaker before, looking at the whole context of slavery, colonialism, bringing different dynamics to our lifestyles. And we can quote, and I didn't want to quote all the theorists out there or people who have been, but we are naturally people here who could sit back in our living rooms, in our dining rooms, in our workplaces, and see the differences and have to learn how to value another person's difference. I remember saying to my wife years ago, let's not do wrong or right. Let's not do bad or good. Let's see how we can identify each other's difference. So you came on one side where I live in, I'm from Trinidad. So I live on one side, Savannah, Queens Park, and you on the other side, but yet we are different. How can we not accuse each other? How can we not judge each other and establish it? And I think from a moral perspective within a society, we at Trinidad people are looking so much now about death and gun violence and so much other domestic violence, all these trauma issues. How do we intervene and establish a way forward? Now, as a pastor, most people in my church have come into my church because of violence. And it was domestic violence. Somebody had a pain, somebody crashed, somebody had a divorce, and people are crying out for help, and they come for solace, they come for change. If they come to me, I have to be careful not to condemn them. And we have to see how that whole context about condemning. Who is condemning you? Jesus told the woman, I don't condemn you, so therefore go and sin no more. What, as Lalor says, sin is not just an issue of personality. It's also social. It's affecting the whole community. How do we work that? So it's the who that condemns, it's the what can condemn. And we need to see it's neither a who nor what. It's that we need not condemn each other or condemn that which we think is wrong, but we need to look to see how we can perpetuate a grace. And that's what we teach. That grace that puts you in a different space that you can continue freely. So am I free in myself? Or will I ever be free? And so that when we look at the issue of where we are going, we are thinking of how we are interpreting our religious perspectives. Everybody can be right about their religious persuasions. Every religion, and coming out of our own slave in a post-colonial world, we came out and developed. I was very happy to hear about it, and I wish I could meet Lalor and have a whole Baptist conversation, because it tries to think of one of the strongest movements is the Baptist Union. Coming out of that from Aruba, most of them, because that's where the slaves landed, and so there was a transition for belief and coming into that space, which is its own. They found a freedom rather than injustice. So will I outlive the stigma and the reproaches that I have there? Do I want freedom or do I want injustice? How do I work this? And it's important for us to see the realness of Jesus' living. Woman, where are thine accusers? Where are they? Having realized that who can plant a stone? Who can really say that I can condemn you and what about you? So when he brought them to a place where they can see for themselves that they can't really accuse this woman when they themselves are guilty of other moral and civil transgressions. Let's use that word. Or indifferences or acts. That therefore they had to just leave her alone. And so that we need to continue to find a self-searching context to find that freedom. rather than to perpetuate injustice. When we look at our nation, coming out in that post-colonial world and coming into independence in 1962, and was there really independence? Even within the church setting, we have to be careful that we do not take the Bible or the scriptures and use this as a weapon tool. We have to be careful how we use it to bring that transition in and that change. And to go back to even my friend from Tobago, looking to see how we can develop that attachment theory, coming into that place where we can find that security. That the first thing was the security as against being anxious or avoidant or disorganized. And it is important for us to bring that sense of community that is necessary for us to go forward. We have become a republic. We have re-identified ourselves with a reconstitutional issue, trying to find reform, but yet we are still struggling because even as a people coming down to the grassroots where religion and culture matters most, it is important for us to really see what's happening at the grassroots level. We need to get back to our communities. So that's why recently, over the last 12 years, I have redesigned my whole church concept and get it working directly with a community, not trying to win the whole tribe to be God's time, but see how we can identify and bring that community into a place where they are functional, where they're sustainable, where they're able to say, look, I own, this is what and that's what we struggle with all day. I own. That's why the gun violence, people are stealing from to own. People are taking from to own. I want mine. You have too much. I want some of that. I want to own peace too. So we have to look at how we are bringing people into that freedom, into that independence, true dependence with freedom. And even if we want to talk about the republic, how do I work that? Now, I want to say something. I had a caption there that I took out, and I see my friend, I say friend, Meade, put it back in capitalism. I really wanted to talk about a bit of that. But I see she brought it very nicely. We have to realize that is also an issue that we have to work and see how we can define. So in concluding here, we need to appreciate that there is a present struggle to define justice. We need to appreciate that we are looking and working with the differences that are real to us. We need to understand that we are still out there judging and trying to get our own the wrong way, rather than recognizing that each of us have a different perspective in terms of how we go. And each of us have different skills and talents that can all contribute to that sustainability for us. So we do not have to fight each other. I sat back last and I say, imagine, let me use this too, black men keep killing black men. We were talking about the white God or the black God. I'm not going on that road today, but again, black men are killing black men. That's what's happening every day. We don't seem to appreciate the value that we have. And there's that justice. We take justice in our own hands. There's a verse that says, vengeance belongs to God. I will repay. And I think we need to come back to that place where we allow God, as we saw in Jesus Christ, establishing that equity there and telling the woman, hey, if there's no acquisition here, I do myself, I, God, the Son of God, do not judge you. I do not curse you. I am not stoning you. I am freeing you. So we need to come to that place where we can identify the urgency for the Morris people, the urgency for that place of change, so that we are no longer eye for eye and tooth for tooth. We are able to turn the cheek and embrace difference and work it for a better tomorrow. So therefore, justice will prevail, not from a punitive position, but from an empowering position as we go along for our future.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Niles, for your presentation and for highlighting the importance of working through differences and with differences. So at this point, I'm going to open the floor for any questions for presenters. You can put your question in the chat. if you have any question. While you're getting your thoughts together, I would like to ask Dr. Meade, you had one other example where you were going to illustrate to us the way in which the ethics of grace can be manifested from theory to action. So I got the first one. I wouldn't mind hearing the.
Okay, sure. I'll quickly
And everybody
share.
else think about your questions in the meantime, so the chair isn't the only one.
Okay, all right, will do. Okay, so yeah, as I was saying, just kind of thinking about these examples, one of which also being drawn directly from my field work at an independent charismatic church in Tivoli Gardens, where every summer they conduct Vacation Bible School. And what I found really remarkable about this Vacation Bible School is that, one, for the church, it's a majority, the majority of the church members are young people who are from the immediate community. And also the founder of the church was a woman, but also was inspired to begin this ministry to meet the needs of women and children. And a lot of the ministry, youth ministry, is oriented towards community development and also personal development by using or applying biblical lessons to real life pressures that they might experience in school, thinking about career planning, and also building a viable life. And so I was really fascinated because a lot of what they were thinking about, right? There was never this emphasis on let's just get rich, right? But there's this idea, this is an example of one of the slides that was used as part of their lessons for some of the teenage students, that personal riches were thought of as it regards to learning, getting training, and also establishing a profession for themselves based on their interests. Mm-hmm. So the last example that I'll share is the Apito Nature Reserve. And pictured here is me being incredibly happy on a farm during my last visit to Trinidad. And I'm standing alongside the staff of the Institute of Indigenous Knowledge, Education, and Research, which is located not far from the Blue Basin waterfall. So the organization, ICUR, was founded by Dr. Tayimba Salandi, and he's a professor of sociology at the UE campus at St. Augustine. And the organization runs ongoing projects aimed at encouraging ecological livelihoods, dialogue, and social justice. They also manage a community-based ecological farm and a nature park as part of their mission to kind of set up an example of the kind of alternative, an alternative and decolonial model of development. And within this model, agriculture and nature are used as a basis for people to learn about history, society, and self. And I have to say, I was incredible. I can't say enough about this organization and the sort of vision of the folks who are involved with it and the importance of it in modeling, again, the kind of non-exploitative, intercommunal kind of ideas about development and that, and thinking about land stewardship as part of that model. And so to conclude, an ethic of grace, again, can orient us to understanding development, not as a zero-sum game where they're winners and losers, they're first world, second world, and third world, right, countries. And that this ethic of grace is one that doesn't necessarily, right, it doesn't have to rely on exclusively or prioritize the concerns of the capitalist order. Rather, grace opens the possibility for engaging in meaningful work that promotes intercommunal reliance, indigenous knowledge, and an understanding that wealth and progress in the context of healthcare, community development, and land stewardship are just as viable. Yeah. All right, so thank you for allowing me to finish that up. I appreciate it.
Oh, thank you very much for sharing your research with us. And I look forward to talking to you in the future about your research. It's always nice to meet another a female academic who sees religion as deserving of serious interrogation and inclusion in discussions about Caribbean identity and development. So I appreciate that. So we have some questions coming in, and the first two that we have are for Dr. Niles. And one is, what is the agenda of your church's role over the next 5 years working in communities? And is its major focus in the short term? I can't hear you, Dr. Niles. You're muted.
Yes. Am I still muted? So
no, we can hear you now.
We have started a program in bringing them to reality. Now, you would not believe that within that community is an East Indian community. We are not here to proselyte. We are here to build. So the first thing we started doing is helping parents to regularize their children in terms of birth certificates so that they can get to school. We also started a homework center, and we also started a primary and kindergarten, where we are facilitating in terms of subsidies, some that they can't pay, some that we give scholarships, but we are doing that. Over the next 5 years, we are trying to get it sustainable. So the first thing we did was to bring in YTEP to do some training. And then for the next couple of years, we will help them to develop the skills that they have. This week, we are establishing a thrift shop. We want to start off by giving, but then we want to help them to see that they could also purchase at maybe a discounted rate to make sure that they become more central in terms of a place where they can come, not just to buy or to get, but also to have church and community. Also, because I'm also a counseling psychologist, we just had a program showing them where they can come in to the offices free of charge and have their talk about the issues, counseling, and of course that is supported too by prayer if they want it. It is not something we are imposing. It is something that we are offering for them to define who they are as people without being looked at as a small-minded people or people who have nothing. Because there's a stigma within the village there. It's one of those villages that you bypass, and there's a lot of gun violence. So since we are there, we have seen a reduction of in the first 2 years, for 5 years, we've had at least 3 deaths. And we haven't had any deaths in the last 5 years. So we are there on 10. So that there's some improvement there, but there's still the kind of feeling of degradation and subservience that we want to work out.
I have a question, and this is particularly targeted to the mainline church representatives and to Chief Massetungi. It's about what is the role of established Christian churches in addressing the ongoing marginalization and victimization and kind of erasure of indigenous and African spiritualities. Do you think there's a role that Christian churches have? Because we hear about working in differences, we hear about the tradition of social justice in the church, but oftentimes the mainline church, the discourse that is taken and circulates outside is used to kind of silence other ways of knowing. And so Chief Massetungi, you can perhaps respond of what kind of engagement you think going forward with established churches. We're all sharing the same socio-political spaces, and of course, Dr. Lalor may address.
Okay, so responding. Now, what happened is that I'm working first of all with the creed and inverted commas of our national anthem. Here, every creed and race find an equal place. But the geopolitics that we have now found ourselves in, they have a historical basis of growth and development. And that basis of growth and development, and it's not peculiar to Caribbean and Trinidad and Tobago, wheresoever people were established in their spaces, in whatever way they saw the supreme and extraterrestrial, non-mundane intelligence and consciousness that guided them, it was somehow tied up and integrated with the management of the people and the spaces and the places. today what has happened is that the world has come to define whatever they call as religion. And I don't necessarily pride myself in being a religious person, but whatsoever they have defined, they have now made it something that is something of the book. So basically, when people speak of religion today, they speak of the peoples of the book. Outside of the book, and that has impacted upon what is present-day traditional spirituality and how we integrate, collaborate, and communicate with other people. So several years ago, I had to attend a funeral. I don't limit myself to your robust secret science only. I have defined myself as an Alkebulanese people, and whereas previously, before I was stolen from Alkebulan, I might have belonged to a particular region. Once I came here, my fight was for the whole of Alkebulan. So having gone back to all of Alkebulan, sometimes I look backward, and some of the material that was available to me was in Kemetic secret science. So there was a young lady whose family was a pastor, Christian pastor. She died, but she was involved around a group that was cultural to which I belonged, and we played drums and music. And so the group took responsibility for part of her traditional rites alongside with her family, one of her family members who was a pastor. But when we arrived there, you know, people now looking to see, as far as they're concerned, we're going to do Obia now, you know, and by the word Obia, I have no problem people calling us Obia or anything, but for them, Obia is non-scientific and synonym. That's why I call what I do Alkebulanese secret science. So when I went there that day, I took one of the books called The Book of Coming Forth by Day and Night, commonly known as the Book of the Dead. I had selected the passages that I want to read because I know now people want to see what we do. So I opened the various chapters and sections and read, and people were, I mean, they thought, you know, they thought, well, all we come to do is throw some oil and rice and some kind of thing and make us such a simile. So there is what is called, now there used to be something, I don't know if it still functions. Years ago, there was something called the Caribbean Conference of Churches. There was some office in Trinidad. They used to publish a newspaper or something. I was involved in trying to promote a social position, and I would distribute the paper. But now I went to join, and then I didn't really reckon. I thought it was just the Caribbean Conference of Churches, and then I realized that you had to be Christian based in order to be a part of this thing. You know, so. What I think that the various spiritualities need to do is to allow ourselves an opportunity to say that, I know it's difficult for people where the basis of your theology is that there is no God but God, whether your God named Jesus, Allah, Elohim. And another thing, we don't have that. You know, people tend to believe that you have to be a monotheist or something like that. Look, we were monotheists as well as we were multi-theists or polytheists in that sense in the continent of Alkebulan. And we did not even need to look outside of ourselves, because I heard reference by one of the speakers to Andrew Springer speaking about Ori. Ori is that minuscule aspect of cosmic intelligence that resides in every living soul and human being to which you can go. But it's not so easy to go to it. So that is what I would say, because I wouldn't want to talk the whole time. That person could talk long sometimes, but that little minuscule of thing that you have there, even though it is there inside of you, you first have to be able to identify it. You know, sometimes somebody says, well, I've introduced you to cocaine. But you don't know what is cocaine, so they could actually give you some white salt. You take some white salt and you think it, and you go on away thinking cocaine is white salt. You know what I mean? So that thing inside there, you have to have an introduction. Life is a series of intercourses and relationships where when we meet people, persons, and situations and things, before trying to take a position, make a judgment, we should listen to it, hear what it has to say, try to understand it, and then develop the relationship.
Yeah. One of the challenges I think Christianity has faced in the region is the associating of the faith with the European culture. And that has impacted our response and embrace of, I call it Africanized Christianity, or Christianity in the region that reflects and use African symbols and images. That has been a real challenge. So what you find happening is earlier, in the early period, the missionaries would say anything that reflects that African cosmology is evil and bad. And that has continued with evangelicalism being perhaps the main religious thing in the Caribbean. It has perpetuated that same perspective. I'll give you an example of Trinidad as a Baptist example. Baptist is supposed to, in Trinidad, you have different types of Baptists. And it is difficult to get them to come together as one family in that regard. So you will see a sign on a church says, so-and-so Baptist, and you see in bracket, London. That is to say, I am completely disassociating myself from the kind of Baptist that you're accustomed to. And I am European in my orientation. That is a challenge that we face. And yet there's an ambiguity. For Jamaica and for the most part, I mean, within most of our families, our parents in the earlier period, they were Anglicans, Methodists, Baptists, Moravians by day, but by night they were revivalists. And that is a feature that has been identified. I saw it within my own family. So it's that kind of ambiguity that has been plaguing us. Dr. Lazarus, I don't know the solution to this. I think it is more.
That's a continuity, but
Yes.
it wasn't that our parents were.
Yes.
When trouble hits, you go back to tradition.
Yes, that is true. So
Yeah.
I think the conversation will have to continue to help persons to realize that, you know, God is that Christianity is not European. And Christianity existed in Africa. Some would say at least 10 generations before it got to Europe. And that though colonial Christianity has European baggage, getting to God, you don't need the baggage. That's perhaps, yes.
I think that's a reality. I grew up that way. My mother, as you said, the Anglican by day, the spiritual, well, she was spiritual Baptist. But when she invited me to the services, I realized there was a liberty,
Yes.
a freedom of expression that she was really enjoying that she could not enjoy in the modern at the high, what we call high mass church. So I think our very being, may I say this, being Black, kind of enforced that kind of needs, that liberated kind of worship and the identity with a God who accepted us as we are. And I think that was one of the things that I had to learn as I grew up. What do I want? And when I read the Bible, I realized put the Bible with us or put the spirituality, but yet the colonial man kind of took that away from me and kind of forced you into that issue of that kind of what we call structured high church, which still continues to agonize our future, our belief systems.
The struggle continues.
The struggle continues. No independence. You
Sorry. I've gone and unmuted myself. So I'm saying that Dr. Meade in the chat here, the chat is firing. So Dr. Meade has kind of summed up the two perspectives, because both Chief Massetungi, as Dr. Meade has pointed out, has kind of highlighted that we need further listening and dialogue, right? Like true dialogues with each other through these differences with respect. And I think that's what Dr. Lalor is kind of saying, that there's no easy solution, but obviously ongoing dialogue in order to, and I think in some ways, Dr. Meade, your presentation also, this notion of lived religion, even though it's very European, our global north, in many ways, it gives us a language to kind of speak to these complexities that everyone so far has been speaking about, the ways in which, if we're not just guided by the scriptures, but the interrelations, the actual everyday living of being spiritual beings, the ways in which we see those kind of synchronizations and complexities and nuances and messiness that don't really, you can't really make sense of it if you just follow the institutional doctrine, right? But we're often put that aside as the person has not fully converted. That's why they still haven't fully converted. So that's the reason they're still turning to the other ways of knowing. But the ways in which we as Caribbean people live, a lot of us, it's not clear cut. Because of the various influences in our identity. But unless we can fully address that and come to terms, and that comes with that psychological, the damage, right? So Mr. Andrews, I don't know if you want to jump in and add anything, and then I'll raise the other two questions in the chat after.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's very insightful. What is being said, even in the context of, to my mind, how do you find the common ground? You know, it's important for us to find this common ground. What I tried to summarize in my presentation was that it becomes difficult for self-validation within each religion. At some point in time, it just becomes a case of, okay, this is how it is. And it suffers from empiricism. So for my mind, what my explorations into psychology have revealed, showing that if you just put on this spiritual lens, you can interpret much of what influences human behavior in a spiritual context as well. And I feel that maybe devotees from each religion may very well have their devotees maybe explore the work of Vygotsky and Piaget and Erikson and those persons. And so that there can be an interrelationship between the work that you see in social science, in psychology and spirituality, and you can see that there are some common threads. And the good thing about it, it does not exclude the view of indigenous and Ifa Orisha, which looks at spirituality in a universal sense. Because from that, I do not see personally it being too abstract to conceive that the earth has a spirit. In the same way, it wouldn't be abstract to consider that anything that has a mass has gravity as a non-directional force. So I think it is easy. It is easy to just put this lens on both the social science and the physical science and come together with religion. And we can see that there is so much commonality that the labels would take on less and less meaning. And the purpose for which we are all here, because not everyone might be able to think, because we all have spiritual gifts. But in appreciating that, it drives you have a different drive. I would like to take this opportunity to make an example of Dr. St. Bernard, because I happen to believe he has a gift. Many people could understand statistics, but it wouldn't drive them to develop a whole thing, to have a whole program at the university and to work relentlessly in terms of bringing many people to that type of study and feed the many tributaries of statistics. It's the same thing why we can't understand It doesn't matter how much you put a bat in somebody's hand, you're not going to get another Brian Lara. So how then do we deal with it? We have gifts, and the people with those gifts have a particular drive that no one else has.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Andrews. We have some questions coming into the chat, and we're rushing for time, but these our attendees have listened to us, and now they want us to engage with them as well. So I just want to get some of those questions out. So we might have to just keep our answers brief, but let's see if we can get some out. So this one is coming from Anisha Lancaster, and it's for anyone to answer. And it says, is there a dying faith among traditional Christianity in the Caribbean? My reason for asking, I was at a prayer meeting for a Methodist elder who died at 80 years old recently, and I was the youngest person there, having been born in the early 1990s. And the closest person to me in age was 10 or 15 years. So similarly, the rallies and the conventions, the conferences of a Christian church that once enjoyed great support from communities seem to wane, especially among young people. So you can think about that question, and I'll move to the other question so that whoever wants to answer, you can just say which one you're answering and jump in. So the other one is also directed to anyone, and it says, the issue of violence and crime, which at this point is a real challenge to sustainable development in the Caribbean. How is religion making sense of this? When you listen to the reasoning for the deviance in there is, or you can hear an analysis of generational oppression and inequality, often legitimized by Christianity with a quotation, during colonialism. It might be challenging for us to move forward, to use values to negotiate peace, etc. So those are two questions. And there's another one directly for Dr. Kenneth that says, what are your views on feminist theology? And does it have a place in the Caribbean? So there's that one. And then there was one earlier on directly for Dr. Niles. And that one was, you indicated that you leave justice to God. How do you know what justice is for God if we are to reconcile God's true words and the words in a Bible subjected to translation, disruption, and manipulation? So I think we can end the segment because questions are coming in. We could do a part 3, Dr. Godfrey.
Yeah, I thought of that. I just thought of that myself. There needs to be a part 3.
Or SALISES a religious cluster. So maybe that's something I could discuss with Dr. Meade to see how we could carry on the work of lived religion and religion in the Caribbean and in UWI. Because it's
let me answer 2 questions quickly in one. Using Bob Andrews, when Andrew spoke of psychology, you see, we have been so blindsided, trying to get people spiritual to heaven, and not dealt with their social and economic needs, and even psychological needs. Because as I said earlier, most people come to my church, and any church, violence, domestic violence, hate, it's always a pain, and we have not dealt with that context. And when you present it, nobody wants it. When I started speaking to psychology 15 years ago, people left my church because they said, hey, you're losing God. And that's why we had the seminar 2 weeks ago, where I had the church come together and showing them the relevance of psychology in context of how they live. So if we can manage that, we will therefore be able to manage social justices, the whole issue of interpretation of values, the interpretation of self, that the issue of ancestral and generational curses or generational dimensions, so that it will bring that healing to people and will be able to intervene for violence. So most of the violence are coming from a generational issue. It's a perpetuating of a societal frames that people are in need, there's lack, and people do not know how to get out of it except if I take from you. So I think we really need to look at the Bible, the more holistic perspective, and not just try to get to heaven, but realize that Monday to Saturday, you have a life to live, and that's where your struggle is. We need to help you how to live outside of the church building and to recognize that there is a way in which we can validate the context of survival and justice, of course, which will bring you into your economic and social stabilities. The issue of feminism, I have made my wife the pastor of the church, so I could deal with more global and national issues and get into that whole frame of community. So because women are skilled, women have fruitfulness, they have the capacity to bring force. And if there's anybody who can bring growth and development and nurturing, is that. And so that when you look at the Bible in terms of Timothy, and you see, women must stay in silence, that was a period of time because of the Ephesian issue and because of how it developed. It was at that time that we have women to listen rather than to speak. It is not that God was saying, women shut up. And so therefore there is a place for females and femininity, because most of the churches are still, it's like any university, 80% women, 20% men. So we need that mothering, we need that consciousness in our society to build that framework and that fabric of growth and development. So women so I'm all for women, not women power, but all for women. And I think that was all the questions that came to me.
Yes.
The first question,
Yeah,
I'd like to make an attempt at the first question,
Yes.
the one about the dying faith, and to say that that is not just a matter of the Christianity declining in the Caribbean, but it is a feature of Christianity in the West. If you notice, all the census is coming out in recent days. UK below 50% for the first time. Australia and the United States, we often mask the fact that a few mega churches have large numbers of persons to mask the reality that actually Christianity on a whole is shrinking within the United States. Now, Christianity is growing in the South, but the Caribbean may be economically South, but in terms of religion, it is aligned. It reflects the features of the West. So it is not just mainline churches in the Caribbean. It really is a decline in Christianity overall. And what you have seen is that where you're seeing growth, these are not new people coming into the faith. They are really musical chairs we are playing. They're leaving one set of churches, going to the other set, and the same set of people. And the result of that is that the young people in particular, that's where we have the largest challenge now. They are turned off. And they're being turned off may be related to your second question, the question about, I think it was violence, and what is the church doing? And that for me, I'm seeing it as a question of relevance. They are not finding the church to be dealing with things that are relevant, and we are not scratching, in their view, where they are itching. That's a real challenge that we have to face. We just have to acknowledge it and face it.
Thank you very much. Dr. Lalor.
May I jump in on this question?
Yes, you may, because I notice you're typing and I can't keep up with your typing.
Yeah. So I think the question about young people and violence is something that's very much at the forefront with a lot of the field work that I do, and particularly in Tivoli Gardens with the history of that community and so on. On one level, I do agree, Reverend Lalor, that it's kind of a musical chairs, and the question of church affiliation has much to do with how we are, the data is being recorded under what kind of categories, what kind of questions are being asked on the census and all of these studies. I think the other piece too is that there is a distinction between religious affiliation and spirituality, right? So you find that, and I would say across diaspora, right, African diaspora, that young people are turning more towards Afrocentric or African-centered spiritualities that are not institutionalized in the way that is easily recognizable by the folks who are doing this kind of research, right? And so when we think about in the US context and the Black Lives Matter movement and the kind of the kind of generational gap between those who were involved in the civil rights movement and the younger people who are in the Black Lives Matter movement, the kind of clash was around of values, right? The place of LGBTQ people in the movement and addressing particular questions of rights and quote unquote respectability, right? There was a stark disagreement, but at the protest, you have people engaging in sort of rituals, right? That are somewhat recognizable as African indigenous rituals. So using sage, certain kind of prayers, right? The way that people consecrate space that is not familiar or kind of easily recognizable from a very Christian point of view, but does relate to a kind of Afrocentric or African-centered indigenous spirituality. So I think a lot of the conversation is, and this is particularly why lived religion is important for me, right, is getting into these communities and talking to young people about how they're envisioning their role in society, how they can contribute as good citizens, the kind of frameworks they're drawing on. It might not be, again, intelligible, right, in the language of Christianity as an institution, but in terms of the lived aspect, right, there's a lot of this blending and integration of African indigenous spiritualities within some frameworks, some Christian frameworks. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I think that's an important point.
May I be able to intervene here?
To add, as we wrap up, so Chief, and then we will give Mr. Andrews the last word, because then we have to wrap up. We can't abuse the audience.
I just want to say this here: the way we have posited spiritual overview is that there is only non-violence and goodness as part of the cosmic whole that is God. But I think when the Christian thing says he's a God of creation and he's a God of destruction, and I don't know if in that context destruction is violent. But what I do know as a scientist is that the human body tells us a lot about cosmic order and cosmic interaction. And there is something in the human body called an antibody. No special ops force in the world is like it. From the time an alien being that might threaten the well-being and wholeness of the body comes in, the role of that antibody is not to capture it and put it in jail and try to change its mind. It's to annihilate it, take it totally out of the thing. As an Orisha devotee, my divinity, Western ways of explaining. But you know, people, we get this problem because we anthropomorphize these deities and make it like ourselves. But they are really principled and sometimes not even in the paradigms that we could utilize here. But I have two main divinities, and they both would fall under these conditions, perhaps violent. But one of them is Ogun. Ogun is a lord of technology, crafting, building, bridges, and all of this. But he understands, if we anthropomorphize that, it understands the principle of violence, weapons, and cleaning, moving things to shape it to where you want it to be. And somebody mentioned psychology. If we were to use some of these traditional people, we wouldn't have problems, because in a sense, the anger that I have within, the violence that I have within, I have externalized it and made it a day. And I know how to appease that day and make it cool and calm, and I know how to excite it. So if we could bring a community, a group of people, a world consciousness, where people could realize that even this thing that this could well wreak havoc, it could be managed a character, and if you know the methodology of going to it, then we would be able to lose some of these unprovoked, as far as I could call it, but unprovoked forms of violence that come. This is all I would say. You know, we have a short time I do put.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chair. I'll be brief. And I would want to join you and some other participants' attempt at trying to get a third. And the reason for it is that in the 11th installment of this series, where we looked at gun violence and homicides and so on, Dr. Elizabeth Ward spoke to the source of much of this violence rooted in trauma in its various forms, from personal, emotional, loss, death, homicide, divorce, whatever. And that what she's saying is that repeated trauma not only affects the emotion, it gets to the point where that affects the architecture of the brain and brain biochemistry. And she spoke about a lot of things, and that's an excellent way that something like this is connected to what was said on another one of SALISES things. So it's important because the work I'm trying to bring to a person's mind now with attachment theory is that then it's an extension of Dr. Ward, meaning it is not only this repeated trauma affecting the anatomy and architecture of the brain, it can wound the spirit. And how through living in this sustainable way, we mend those spiritual wounds and move ahead as among humane society. Thank you.
Thank you. Nice way of ending. Thank you very much. I'm going to hand over to Dr. St. Bernard to give his closing remarks. But before I do, I don't think I need to come back in, Godfrey. So I will just say thank you very much to all the presenters. I truly feel full. I felt like from a different perspective, you've given me a lot to think about. I feel energized spiritually, but also thinking about academically, right? So on behalf of the audience, I'm saying thank you for sharing your thoughts with us and your work and what you're passionate about. And I hope the others, and I can see from the chat that there are others out listening that also feel extremely grateful for you to take the time to share your work with us. And we hope the discussions can continue and religion isn't just marginalized in serious discussion, right? So thank you very much. And thanks for the audience for sticking with us. I know this one has been a bit longer than the other forums, but we are appreciative that you were able to stay with us. And thanks, Dr. St. Bernard and your team at SALISES St. Augustine for organizing the event once again, for inviting me to be a part of it, and for doing this all. So thank you, and I'm going to hand over to Dr. St. Bernard for him to give his final closing. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Latoya, for your kind words, and I'm happy you began the vote of thanks because the person, Mr. Donnell Coffey, who was supposed to do the vote of thanks, unfortunately, he's unavailable due to arrangements at his workplace and his commitment to duty there. So thank you for doing the vote of thanks. And I'd like to also extend thanks just to the marketing and communication crew for their continuous support in ensuring the success of all of the forums we have had, all 18 forums. I really want to thank Ms. Josanne Green and her colleagues at the MNC UWI for making this happen. I also want to, quite apart from the thanks that were given by Latoya to the speakers, the audience, the virtual audience, we could not have had this without the speakers and the virtual audience, the speakers being Chief Oloye, Olakela, Massetungi, Dr. Dennis Meade, Reverend Glenroy Lalor, Mr. Bobby Andrews, Reverend Dr. Kenneth Niles, and Dr. Michael Barnett. Thank you for the great work that you did and the preparations that you really endured, and of course, the expert deliveries that you gave. Tremendous thanks to our chairperson, Dr. Latoya Lazarus, my colleague, my SALISES colleague. Thank you very much, Latoya, greatly appreciated. And also, I would like to say a personal thanks to, the staff here at SALISES, without whom this could not have happened. In particular, Miss Elsa Hamilton. Miss Elsa Hamilton, she was the engine room, in a sense, in terms of, and the elbow grease for making this happen. And I want to extend my sincerest thanks to Elsa for the work she put in to make this happen. She was ably supported at times by Ms. Katian Modest and Ms. Francine Allen. And also I want to thank specifically Mr. Ephraim Thompson for the technical aspects and the support he has given. I also want to thank Mr. Manta Morgan, who has been doing some work behind the scenes to ensure that today's forum went off the way it went off. It has been indeed a treat, and after part one, there was a call for part two, and now I'm hearing a call for part three. And I don't have to. I don't have too long again in SALISES. I mean, my days in SALISES are almost numbered, but I may consider perhaps having a part three as a closing salvo, so to speak. I think it is a very important topic. And I'm really happy that Mr. Andrews in particular drew some parallels between some of the discussions that emerged in the 11th forum when we spoke about crime and violence in Caribbean societies, and especially the presentation made by Dr. Ward, who incidentally is Jamaican. And he saw the connections with what we have been talking about here. In fact, as you go through many of the forums we have had, there are serious interconnections taking place. And I'm really gratified, that, I have had such a helpful and supportive staff and colleagues who have enabled, SALISES to pull off this series. And I hope even after I would have left SALISES, having retired, that somewhere along the line, this agenda will be sustained. And I really look forward, sitting down in a living room somewhere and tuning into these sessions and really enjoying them. SALISES has done quite a bit over the past year. We have had 3 conferences out of SALISES in Augustine. We had in October last year, we had the Toronto Metropolitan University UWI RCYP conference on the rights and well-being of children and young people in Latin America and the Caribbean. 40+ papers, bilingual conference. And in April this year, we had the 50th anniversary conference of the Black Power Revolution, again by SALISES, about 37 presentations. And just about 2 weeks ago, we had the 24th annual SALISES conference where we had about 86 presentations over 3 days. And we have been on a roll. So I think, we are somewhat tired, and we would, if we do the part 3, it would be with some reservation, but perhaps we will make it happen just as a last salvo. So again, thanks to all for making it happen. And I'm really appreciative of your efforts. Have a wonderful day all, and stay tuned. We will be in touch.
Thanks, Godfrey, for your hard work.
Goodbye. Thank you, Godfrey, for having me.
No problem at all. Always a pleasure.
Thanks to everyone.
Thank you for your engagement, everyone. I learned so much from all of you. Thank you.
Nice meeting you, Dennis.
All the best.
Thank you. Thank you. Take care.
Good to hear you. I'll try and find Lalor.
Yes, I'd love to meet you. I'll come to Trinidad one day and find you.
Oh, you know what? Interestingly enough, I'm Jamaican. I was born there, but I do work in Trinidad and Jamaica.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. Thank you all. This was a blessing. Thank you. And honor to you, Chief Massetungi. Thank you for your time.
Yes.
Goodbye.
Okay. Yeah.